The smoke hadn't reached the east corridor yet, but Sawyer Rourke already knew the building was going to blow. He'd been trying to tell them for 40 minutes. Nobody listened. Now the CEO was trapped behind a containment barrier with two of her people. The pressure gauges were screaming in red, and the man everyone had dismissed as just the night shift maintenance guy was standing at the threshold of a collapsing building, deciding whether to go back in. He thought about his daughter, Emery, 13 years old, probably already texting him about what she wanted for dinner. Then Sawyer Rourke pulled his collar up over his mouth and ran back into the smoke. If this story moved you, hit subscribe right now because every week we bring you stories just like this one. Stories about ordinary people who turn out to be anything but. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all started. The shift started the way every shift started. Sawyer clocked in at 11:14 p.m., 2 minutes before his scheduled time, because he'd learned a long time ago that arriving exactly on time meant you'd already missed something. He signed the maintenance log at the front desk, nodded at the security guard, a heavy-set man named Denny, who always had a crossword puzzle folded under his forearm, and walked the long corridor to the equipment room without turning on the overhead lights. He knew the path well enough. 5 years of night shifts had worn a groove in his memory. Ashcroft Dynamics occupied a sprawling industrial complex outside the city, 3 main production wings, an administrative tower that nobody in the plant called anything except the glass box, and a cluster of auxiliary buildings that housed generator backups, chemical storage, and the kind of infrastructure that most people never thought about until something went wrong. The facility manufactured precision aerospace components for defense contractors, and it ran 7 days a week in 2 shifts. Days were loud and crowded. Nights were quieter, which suited Sawyer. He liked the quiet. He worked better in it. His job title was Maintenance Technician 2, which in practical terms meant he was responsible for everything the daytime engineers didn't want to deal with after 5 o'clock. Coolant pressure readings, hydraulic line inspections, sensor calibration checks along the eastern production wing. He did the work the building needed to stay functional, and he did it without being asked twice, and that was mostly the extent of his relationship with management. His supervisor, a distracted man named Paulson, communicated exclusively through maintenance tickets and the occasional sticky note left on the equipment room whiteboard. Sawyer had met the COO, Blaine Carrick, exactly twice, once during a safety walkthrough 2 years prior, and once in a hallway when Carrick had walked past him without acknowledgement. Which was fine. Sawyer wasn't there for the acknowledgement. He was there so he could be home before Emery's alarm went off. That was the whole math of it. Night shift ended at 7 a.m. Emery's school started at 8:15. By the time Sawyer pulled into the driveway, changed out of his work clothes, and got the coffee going, she'd be coming downstairs in whatever combination of mismatched layers she'd decided counted as an outfit that week. They had maybe 45 minutes together every morning breakfast, whatever conversation she was willing to have before she fully woke up, and then he walked her to the corner before she disappeared with her earbuds in toward the bus stop. Then he slept until 3, picked her up from school at 3:30, and the cycle repeated. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the life anyone who'd known him at 25 would have predicted for him. But it was the life he'd chosen, deliberately and without regret, and on most nights that fact sat with him in something close to peace. Tonight was not shaping up to be most nights. He noticed the first anomaly at 11:47. He was running his standard inspection along the east wing's secondary coolant loop, a task he could do in his sleep when the digital readout on panel E7 caught his eye. The thermal sensor registered 4 degrees higher than its baseline. Not dramatically high, not the kind of number that would set off an automated alarm. But Sawyer had been reading that panel for 5 years, and 4 degrees on a night, this cool meant something in the line was generating heat it shouldn't be. He logged it, reset the calibration check, and moved on. At 12:23, he found the second one, panel E12. Pressure differential reading that didn't match the flow rate on the adjacent gauge. Again, not catastrophic on its own. But pressure differentials that didn't match flow rates meant something in the line between the 2 points was behaving unexpectedly, a partial blockage, hence a leak, or stress on a fitting that hadn't been there before. He logged that one too, flagged it for a daytime inspection, and kept moving. At 12:50, he found the third. He wasn't looking for it. He'd stopped at the main control junction at the south end of the east wing to cross-reference his calibration readings with the central monitoring display, a ritual he'd developed purely out of habit when he saw it. Not a sensor anomaly this time. Something worse. The emergency shutdown switch for the east wing was in manual override. Sawyer stared at it for a moment. The automatic emergency shutdown was a failsafe. In the event of a critical sensor threshold being crossed, it was supposed to cut power to the east wing's production systems and seal the internal pressure lines within 90 seconds. It was never supposed to be in manual override during active production hours. That was in the safety protocol. That was in the federal guidelines the plant operated under. Disabling automatic shutdown during production wasn't a maintenance decision. It required executive sign-off, and it required a documented reason. He pulled up the override log on the control terminal. The entry read Production Continuity Authorization B. Carrick 1840. Blaine Carrick had authorized the override 6 hours ago, during the day shift, before anyone who worked nights had come in. Sawyer stood there for a moment, with his hand resting on the terminal housing, doing arithmetic in his head that he didn't particularly want to do. 3 anomalous sensor readings. An emergency shutdown disabled by executive order. East wing running at full production capacity on a night when something in the coolant system was generating unexplained heat. He'd seen a version of this before. Not here. Somewhere else, in a different life, in a context he rarely thought about anymore. He'd seen what happened when warning signs got ignored because the people who could read them didn't have the authority to act on them, and the people who had the authority weren't paying close enough attention. He picked up his radio. "Paulson," he said. "You on tonight?" Static. Then Sawyer? "Yeah, I'm here. What's up?" "I need you to look at something on E-Wing. You got a minute?" "It's 1 in the morning. I know what time it is." A pause. "What am I looking at?" Sawyer described the 3 readings. He described the override. He kept his voice level and his language precise, because he'd learned over years in environments where imprecision got people hurt that panic. In your voice was the fastest way to make someone stop listening to the words. Paulson was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I'll call the duty manager." "Do that," Sawyer said, "and tell him about the override." The duty manager that night was a man named Hirsch, who showed up 14 minutes later with the slightly rumpled look of someone who'd been woken up and didn't appreciate it. Sawyer walked him through everything, panel by panel, showing him the readings on the control display. Hirsch looked at the numbers. He looked at the override log. He rubbed the back of his neck. "I can't authorize a shutdown without executive approval," Hirsch said. "The override came from Carrick." "I understand that," Sawyer said. "I'm not asking you to shut it down. I'm asking you to escalate it to someone who can." "It's 1 in the morning." "I know." Another long pause. "The readings are within operational range, technically." "Individually," Sawyer said. "Taken together, they're not." Hirsch looked at him with the particular expression that supervisors use when they're deciding whether to take a subordinate seriously. Sawyer had seen that expression his entire adult life. As a junior enlisted man. As a technician. Every time he'd walked into a room with more rank and fewer answers than the people around him. "I'll make a note of it," Hirsch said. "First thing tomorrow, we'll have engineering take a look." "Tomorrow might be too late." "It'll be fine, Sawyer." It would not be fine. He spent the rest of the night monitoring. He didn't have the authority to shut anything down, and he'd already escalated through the proper channel, and Hirsch had made his choice. So Sawyer did what he could with what he had. He walked the east wing every 40 minutes instead of every 2 hours. He kept the control terminal open on his tablet. He documented every reading, every timestamp, every deviation from baseline, in a personal log that was separate from the official maintenance record, not because he planned to use it for anything, but because the habit of keeping his own record was too deeply ingrained to break. By 4 a.m., panel E7's thermal reading had climbed another 2 degrees. By 5:30, the pressure differential on E12 had widened. By 6 a.m., a 4th sensor one, he hadn't checked in his initial pass because it was on a secondary loop that rarely showed anything unusual, was flagging a reading that made the back of his neck tighten. He radioed Hirsch again. Hirsch told him the day shift would handle it. At 7:10, the day shift arrived. At 7:40, Sawyer should have been clocking out and heading to his car. Instead, he was still in the East Wing, standing at panel E7 with his tablet in his hand. A cluster of people in business attire appeared at the far end of the production floor. He recognized Blaine Carrick's gray suit, the kind of posture that announced itself before the man did, moving through the space like the facility existed for his benefit. Behind him were 3 or 4 other people in similar attire, and beside him was a woman Sawyer didn't recognize. Dark blazer, mid-30s, moving with the quiet attention of someone who was actually looking at the pss rather than performing for it. He found out later she was the CEO. That morning, Genevieve Marlowe was conducting her first on-site inspection of Ashcroft Dynamica's largest production facility since taking the role 6 months prior. She'd come early on purpose, before the official tour was scheduled to begin, because she'd found that facilities looked different when they didn't know you were coming. She was making notes on a small leather portfolio when Sawyer crossed the production floor toward them. Carrick saw him first. His expression shifted into something not quite a frown, more like the expression of a man recalculating whether something was worth his time. "Can I help you?" Carrick said. Not a question. The syntax of a question, but the tone of a dismissal. "There's a safety issue on this production wing," Sawyer said. He addressed it to the group, because he'd learned that addressing it only to the person most likely to dismiss him was a losing strategy. "I've been monitoring it since midnight. I need someone with authority to authorize a shutdown." Carrick's expression settled into something flatter. "And you are Sawyer Rourke, night maintenance." "Right." Carrick said it the way you'd say right when someone confirmed something you'd already decided didn't matter. "What's the issue?" Sawyer laid it out. He kept it brief and specific, 4 sensor anomalies over a 7-hour period, progressive rather than static, the pattern of escalation consistent with thermal stress on a pressure line. And the override. He mentioned the override last, because it was the most significant piece, and he wanted them to hear the evidence first. One of the men in business attire, someone from the executive team, Sawyer assumed glanced at Carrick. Carrick's face had gone through something while Sawyer was talking, some internal recalibration, and now it had settled into an expression Sawyer recognized without warmth. The expression of a man who'd already decided the problem was the person raising the concern, not the concern itself. "The override was authorized for a reason," Carrick said. "We have a major production deadline tomorrow. Shutting down the East Wing tonight would have set us back by 11 hours. "I understand that," Sawyer said. "These sensors throw variance readings all the time. It's a known issue on this wing. 4 sensors, progressive escalation over 7 hours isn't variance." "Mr. Rourke." Carrick said the name with the specific inflection of a man emphasizing that he was using it as a courtesy. "You're a maintenance technician. You read dials. I appreciate that you take your job seriously, but this facility has a full engineering team and an automated monitoring system. If there were a genuine safety issue, we would know. The automated monitoring system's emergency shutdown has been disabled." A brief silence. Then Carrick smiled the kind of smile that doesn't reach anything above the cheekbones. "By my authorization, which I'm permitted to give." The woman Marlowe hadn't said anything yet. She was watching Sawyer, with the kind of focused attention he recognized from people who were genuinely trying to assess a situation rather than manage it. She had a small smudge of blue ink on the side of her right hand, like she'd been writing fast and caught her palm on the page. He noticed it for no particular reason except that he noticed things. "How long have you been monitoring this?" she asked. "Since about 11:50 last night. And you flagged it to your supervisor?" At 12:50, they escalated to the duty manager. Duty manager said to let the day shift handle it. She glanced at Carrick. Something passed between them that Sawyer couldn't fully read. "What specifically are you recommending?" she asked. "Shut down East Wing production. Bring in engineering to inspect the E12 pressure line and the secondary loop on E7. Don't restart until you know what's causing the thermal escalation." Carrick made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Do you have any idea what that costs us?" "I have some idea what it costs if you don't," Sawyer said. Carrick turned to Marlowe. "Ms. Marlowe, I've been running operations at this facility for 4 years. I can tell you with confidence that what Mr. Rourke is describing is well within normal operational parameters. These are known sensor sensitivities. The readings he's flagging are within." "They were within range at midnight," Sawyer said. They've been moving in one direction for 7 hours. Carrick's voice sharpened. I'm talking. So am I. The silence after that had a particular texture to it. Sawyer was aware that he'd just interrupted a senior executive in front of the CEO, which was the kind of thing that had consequences. He was also aware that he didn't have time to be strategic about it. The readings on E7 had gone up 2 degrees in the last 90 minutes. He'd done this math before in other contexts, with other variables, and the arithmetic always felt the same. Not panic, just a very clear sense of the clock. Carrick looked at him the way men look at things they're about to remove from the room. Mr. Rourke, he said, quietly now, which was somehow worse than when he'd been louder. You make what, $22 an hour? You've been here 5 years, you've been promoted once, and your performance reviews indicate that you do your job adequately. That's what you are, a technician who does his job adequately. He paused. I went to MT. I have a master's degree in industrial engineering and 14 years of executive operations experience. So when I tell you that this facility's systems are operating normally, you should consider the possibility that I know something you don't. Sawyer let that sit for a moment. The sensors don't know about your degree, he said. Marlowe turned away slightly, and Sawyer had the impression, just an impression, that she was covering something. What Carrick said next, Sawyer would remember for a long time afterward. Not because it hurt it didn't, not exactly, but because of who was standing there to hear it. I want this man out of this wing, Carrick said to the facilities manager who'd appeared at the edge of the group. And when this tour is finished, I want his supervisor on the phone. We'll discuss whether someone with his attitude is the right fit for this team. Marlowe finally spoke. Blaine, we have a tour to conduct. Blaine, quieter this time. She was looking at the tablet in Sawyer's hand. Can I see those readings? Sawyer handed it over. She looked at it for a long moment, not performing looking, actually looking. Then she handed it back and said, to Carrick, without raising her voice, shut down half the east wing. The section running off the E12 line. Let the other section continue. Carrick stared at her. It's not a suggestion. Another silence. Carrick nodded once and took out his phone. It wasn't enough. Sawyer knew it wasn't enough. The secondary loop running off E7 fed both sections, and a partial shutdown didn't address the source of the thermal variance. But he'd been in enough rooms to know when he'd gotten as much as he was going to get from the people who held the authority. He could either spend the next 20 minutes arguing for the full shutdown and lose, or he could use those 20 minutes. He chose the 20 minutes. He walked back to the east wing and he started counting people. 58 workers on the east production floor that morning. Day shift in full, a few maintenance staff who'd stayed late like himself, 2 quality control technicians running early checks. Sawyer identified the 4 nearest exits, noted which ones were clear, and which had equipment staged near the doors that would slow an evacuation. He moved the equipment without explaining why. He checked the service corridor behind panel row E, the one that ran the length of the wing and connected to the auxiliary exit on the building's north side, a corridor that most day shift workers had probably never used because it wasn't on the standard floor plan. He did all of this quietly, without announcing it, because announcing it would have caused exactly the kind of disruption that Carrick would have used as a reason to have him escorted out. He was on his 3rd pass through the wing when the thermal reading on E7 jumped. Not 2 degrees this time. 9 degrees in under 4 minutes. Sawyer looked at the number. He looked at the pressure reading on E12, which had just moved outside its operational range for the first time all night. He thought, that's it. And then he stopped thinking and started moving. He found the emergency alarm panel at the north end of the wing, the manual override, the red cover, the pull handle that every employee was shown during orientation, and that most of them had never touched in their careers. He broke the cover. The plastic cracked in his hand. Somewhere behind him, he heard a voice one of the floor supervisors say, "Hey, what are you doing?" Sawyer pulled the handle. The alarm was very loud. Across the production floor, 58 people stopped what they were doing. Some of them looked at each other. Some of them looked up at the ceiling, as if the source of the sound might be visible. Some of them started moving immediately, and some of them stood still, and for a few seconds, the east wing existed in that particular suspended state that happens in the gap between an alarm going off and human beings deciding to believe it. Sawyer was already moving. He went to the nearest cluster of workers, 4 men near the central assembly line, and pointed them toward the south exit without breaking stride. That door now, keep moving. He didn't ask. He didn't explain. He'd learned in a different context that people in uncertain situations respond to confidence and direction, not to information. Sir, we're supposed to wait for— Walk, Sawyer said. I'll explain outside. He moved to the next group. And the next. Carrick appeared at the east wing entrance, face red, phone in hand. Someone shut that alarm off who pulled that— Get out of the building, Sawyer said without looking at him. I'm going to have you arrested. There are 58 people on this floor. Please help me move them. Carrick did not help him move them. But he also stopped standing in the exit, which Sawyer counted as acceptable. The evacuation took 6 minutes. Sawyer had hoped for 4, but 6 was within range. Workers filed out through 3 exits, and Sawyer put a man he trusted, a maintenance tech named Okafor, who'd worked nights almost as long as Sawyer had on the count at the south exit, while he covered the north himself. He was counting the last of them through when the pressure line on E12 gave. It wasn't an explosion. Not yet. It was a rupture, a sound like something tearing at a frequency too low to be comfortable, followed by a rush of steam from the junction housing, and then an automated containment response that the facility's secondary systems triggered because the primary shutdown was still in manual override. The containment barrier dropped. It was a physical barrier, a series of reinforced panels that descended from the ceiling and locked into floor-level channels, designed to isolate a pressure rupture and prevent cascading failure through the rest of the facility. In a normal shutdown scenario, it would have engaged after the production floor had been cleared. In a manual override scenario, it engaged on its own timeline. Sawyer was at the north exit when it dropped. He heard the sound of the panels locking. He heard, a moment later, someone shouting from inside the wing. He turned. Through the narrow gap at the base of the barrier, visible through the smoke that was beginning to fill the lower half of the wing, he could see the beam of a flashlight. Someone was still inside. He grabbed the arm of the worker nearest to him, Okafor, and said, "Keep counting. Don't stop. I need the full number." Then he looked at the barrier, and the smoke, and the sound coming from somewhere inside the building that he recognized as the particular quality of something not yet done failing. He thought about Emery. He thought, she'll understand. He thought, she won't, actually. She'll be furious. He thought, good. That means she'll be fine. Sawyer Rourke pulled his collar up over his nose and walked back through the emergency exit door he'd just come out of, moving in the direction opposite to every person around him, and disappeared into the smoke. The smoke inside the east wing was low and fast-moving, the kind that hugged the floor and climbed the walls and filled the middle of a room in less time than it had any right to. Sawyer had seen worse. He'd been in spaces where you couldn't see your hand at arm's length, where the only navigation was memory and the occasional brush of your fingers along a wall. This was bad, but it wasn't that. Not yet. He moved fast and low, keeping his collar against his mouth, breathing through the fabric in short, deliberate pulls. His eyes were already adjusting. The emergency lighting had kicked in along the floor, a strip of amber that ran the length of the evacuation path, but the path it marked led to the exits he'd already cleared, not toward whoever was still inside. The flashlight beam he'd seen through the gap in the containment barrier was somewhere ahead and to his left. East side of the wing, near the junction corridor that connected the main production floor to the quality control station. That put them deep further in than he'd have liked. Further from the service corridor he intended to use as his exit route. He didn't call out yet. Calling out meant breathing in, and he wasn't ready to do that. He passed the row of assembly stations, the equipment dark now, the half-finished components still resting in their fixtures, like the shift had simply paused. Past panel E9, E10, the thermal readout on E11 glowing red in the dimness. The rupture on E12 had happened 2 junctions back from where he was, and the steam had mostly vented upward, which was the only good piece of news in the building right now. Then he heard a voice. 2 voices, actually. One of them was trying to stay calm and failing at it. The other one was steady, which surprised him, because the steady one was female, and he hadn't expected to find the CISOs of a company still inside a building that was actively telling everyone to leave. He found them at the junction corridor entrance. Genevieve Marlowe was crouched against the wall, with her portfolio clutched to her chest, and her phone-out flashlight on. No signal, which explained why nobody outside knew exactly where she was. Beside her were two men in Ashcroft work polos, both of them younger, both of them looking at the containment barrier, 20 feet behind them, with the expression of people who had run the math and didn't like the answer. One of them, tall, early 30s, a name badge that read DeLuca, had blood on his forearm from where he'd caught the edge of something in the scramble. Not bad, but his hands were shaking. The other one, shorter, said, "Oh, thank God," when Sawyer appeared out of the smoke, which was an understandable reaction, but also meant he'd been breathing too hard, and Sawyer needed him to stop. "Hey," Sawyer said. "Look at me, both of you." They looked. "Slow your breathing down. I mean it. You'll make it worse if you panic. Follow me and stay close." DeLuca pressed his good hand against the wall to push himself upright. The barrier dropped while we were still. We were at the back checking calibration. We didn't hear the alarm until... "I know," Sawyer said. "It doesn't matter. Are either of you hurt? Beyond the arm?" DeLuca shook his head. The other man said, "My knee." "It's I can walk, then walk." He looked at Marlowe. She'd already gotten to her feet without being asked, which he noted. Her blazer had a long gray smudge across the shoulder, and her hair had come partially loose, but her eyes were clear. Frightened? Yes, but working. She was assessing him with the same attention she'd used in the production floor earlier, trying to determine whether he actually knew what he was doing. He appreciated that she was still doing it. It was a more useful response than the alternative. "There's a service corridor behind panel row E," he said. "It runs the length of the wing and exits on the north side of the building, outside the containment zone. It's not on the standard floor plan, but it's accessible through the maintenance panel at E14. I need you to follow me, stay together, keep moving. Don't stop for anything." "The barrier," Marlowe said. "Can we go back through?" "Not without tools I don't have. The service corridor is faster anyway." She nodded. No argument, no second guessing. He moved to the front and they fell in behind him. The walk to E14 took less than 90 seconds, which felt much longer. The smoke was thicker than it had been when he'd first come in. Whatever was happening in the E12 junction had escalated, and the heat along the floor had noticeably increased. The shorter man, Sawyer, still hadn't caught his name, was limping, but keeping pace. DeLuca had put his injured arm against his chest and was breathing through his nose the way Sawyer had told him to. Marlowe didn't say anything. She kept one hand lightly on DeLuca's shoulder, guiding him forward without crowding Sawyer, which was exactly the right thing to do in a confined space with bad visibility. He didn't compliment her on it. There wasn't time, and she'd probably find it condescending regardless. The maintenance panel at E14 was a flush-mounted door in the wall, painted the same industrial gray as everything else in the wing, with a recessed handle that you'd miss if you didn't know it was there. Sawyer had used it maybe a dozen times over 5 years, usually to access the service conduits running behind the panel array, occasionally to shortcut to the north auxiliary exit when he was running late. It was a maintenance corridor, which meant it was narrow, and it smelled like machine oil, and it had no emergency lighting. He pulled the handle and the door opened. "Single file," he said. "I'll be in front. Stay close enough to touch the person ahead of you." "How far?" Marlowe asked. "Maybe 110 feet. Then a turn left, then the exit hatch, okay." The three of them filed in behind him. He pulled the panel door shut. The darkness in the corridor was complete, the kind of dark that makes your eyes do involuntary things trying to find something to focus on. He heard DeLuca exhale sharply and then pull it back together. "Talk to me if you're struggling," Sawyer said. "Otherwise, just move." He moved. He kept his left hand on the conduit housing that ran along the wall at shoulder height, using it as a guide rail. The floor was uneven. He remembered that a seam where the concrete had been poured in 2 sections that had settled slightly differently over the years. He warned them about it when he felt the edge under his foot. "Step up about half an inch right here. Tell the person behind you." He heard the relay DeLuca's voice, then Marlowe's, and then the sound of their footsteps resuming. 60 feet in, the shorter man's breathing became audible. Sawyer slowed fractionally. "What's your name?" "Price," the man said. "Marcus Price. How's the knee, Marcus?" "Hurts." "But you're moving." "Yeah, good enough." He paused. "Keep one hand on DeLuca in front of you. Don't lose the contact." "Okay, you're doing fine." It wasn't entirely true. Price's breathing was too fast, and the knee was slowing him down, but Sawyer had found, over years of moving people through bad situations, that the truth about how someone was doing was far less useful than a credible assertion that they were managing. People could run on that for a long time if you said it with enough conviction. They reached the turn at 90 feet, left, then the exit hatch another 20 feet ahead. The exit hatch was a secondary egress point, a reinforced door with a push-bar mechanism on the interior side. This is designed for emergency use only. Sawyer had used it twice before, both times without incident. He reached it in the dark, found the push-bar by memory, and pushed. It didn't move. He pushed again harder, nothing. He felt for the problem with both hands, running his palms along the bar, the housing, the hinges. His hands found it before his brain fully processed it. The hatch had been latched from the outside. Someone, probably during a routine maintenance cycle, probably without any malice whatsoever, had secured it from the exterior. It was the kind of thing that happened in a large facility when people stopped thinking about whether a door needed to be accessible from both sides. Behind him, Marlowe said quietly, "Problem? Working on it." He kept his voice flat. The latch mechanism was on the exterior. He couldn't reach it from inside. But the hatch itself was a push door, which meant its structural integrity was in the frame, and the frame was bolted to concrete that was 30 years old. He pressed his palm flat against the door, feeling for give. There was some. Not much, but some. He took 2 steps back in the narrow corridor, which was all the runway he had. "Move against the wall," he said. "Both of you, give me what space you can." He heard them shift. Then he hit the door. Not a running start, he couldn't get enough speed in 2 steps for that to matter. What he hit it with was weight and angle and the specific physics of driving your shoulder into a hinged surface at the point where the frame was weakest, which was the lower corner opposite the hinges. He'd been told once, years ago, by an instructor whose name he'd mostly forgotten, that doors don't break in the middle, they break where the frame stops trusting itself. The door shuddered. The frame cracked partially. He hit it again. This time it gave not all the way, but enough. The lower corner swung out 4 inches. Cold morning air came through the gap, and the smoke in the corridor moved toward it like it had been waiting. Sawyer got his fingers into the gap and pulled. His hands were not small, and the gap was not large, and it took approximately 30 seconds of sustained effort. 30 seconds in which he was aware of the sound coming from deeper in the building behind them, the particular low vibration that preceded a pressure event, the way the floor was carrying it up through his boots before the door came fully open. He turned back. "Go DeLuca first, then Price. Move fast." DeLuca went through without hesitating. Price was slower. The knee made the threshold awkward, but he made it. Sawyer went last, pulling the door shut behind him on the off chance it made any difference. They were outside. The morning air hit him like a physical thing. Not cold enough to hurt, but cold enough that after the smoke and heat of the east wing, it felt almost violent. He could hear sirens in the middle distance, 2 or 3 vehicles, and the rising sound of a crowd that had gathered along the facility perimeter. Someone behind the crowd barrier was shouting instructions with a bullhorn. He put his hand on DeLuca's shoulder and steered him toward the perimeter. "Walk. Don't look back. The emergency crews are at the south gate." "What about?" DeLuca started. "Move first," Sawyer said. Questions later. They'd covered maybe 40 feet when the east wing made a sound. It was not the explosion that came later. This was the precursor, a deep groaning compression, the sound of a structure disagreeing with the forces being applied to it, followed by a crack that Sawyer felt in his back teeth more than heard. A section of the east wing's roofline shifted, visibly sagged inward along the eastern edge, and a plume of smoke and steam punched up through the gap and began spreading into the morning sky. Price stumbled. Sawyer caught him by the elbow without breaking stride. "Keep moving." They reached the perimeter. A pair of emergency response workers in yellow vests materialized and took DeLuca and Price by the arms, steering them toward the medical triage area that had been set up on the south side of the parking lot. Sawyer let them go and turned back, not to go inside again. He was outside and he intended to stay outside, but he needed to see the count. He found Okafor near the south gate, holding a clipboard and looking simultaneously focused and deeply alarmed at the state of Sawyer's face, which Sawyer assumed had acquired some soot along the way. "What's the number?" Sawyer said. Okafor looked at his clipboard. 55 confirmed out. That was 58 on the floor. "I know. 3 unaccounted. So look back at the facility." He'd brought out Marlowe and DeLuca and Price. 3. 55 plus 3 was 58. I've got your 3, he said. They're at medical triage. Okafor looked up from his clipboard. Then he exhaled with his entire body, shoulders, chest, everything, and made the notation. 58 accounted for. Genevieve Marlowe was sitting on the running board of an emergency vehicle when Sawyer found her 20 minutes later. She had a foil blanket draped over her shoulders that she clearly hadn't put there herself, and a paper cup of something that was probably coffee in her hands. The portfolio was gone. She'd lost it somewhere in the wing, or left it, or let someone take it. The leather portfolio, with the notes from her morning walk through. He hadn't seen it since the junction corridor. She looked up when he approached. Her eyes moved over him, assessing again, but differently now. Checking for damage. DeLuca and Price, she said. Price's knee will need imaging. DeLuca's arm is superficial. They're both fine, she nodded. And you? I'm fine. You went back in. You were still inside, after you'd already gotten out. He didn't say anything to that. There wasn't much to say. She was looking at him like she was trying to locate the version of this that made complete sense to her and wasn't quite finding it. You pulled the alarm, she said, without authorization. Blaine had authorization over the override. I didn't have a way through that in the time I had. You knew that would end your career here. I knew it might. Marlowe wrapped both hands around the paper cup. She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the facility, the smoke still rising from the east wing, the emergency vehicles repositioning, the crowd of 58 workers gathered in clusters along the perimeter, alive and accounted for, some of them with blankets, and some of them making phone calls, and some of them just standing and looking at the building. The way you look at something, you can't quite believe you're not inside anymore. I want to ask you something, she said, and I want an honest answer. Okay, when did you know it was serious? He thought about it. Not performing consideration, actually thinking back to 12:50 a.m., to the control terminal, to the moment he'd seen the override log. When I saw the override, he said. Before that, I thought it was probably a maintenance issue. After the override, I knew someone had made a decision that took the safety net out of the equation. That's when the other readings stopped being coincidences. And Hirsch did what he had to do. He can't authorize a shutdown against a CO-level override. That's above his pay grade, but not above mine. No. Marlowe looked at him steadily. I should have shut it all down this morning. Not half. He didn't confirm it because she wasn't asking him to. She knew. She was saying it out loud because that was what people with integrity did when they'd made the wrong call. They said it. They didn't dress it up. You didn't have the full picture, Sawyer said. I had enough. He left that alone. Across the parking lot, a car door slammed. Sawyer looked up and saw Blaine Carrick moving through the perimeter crowd with 2 men from the executive team flanking him, talking fast, his expression carrying that particular quality of a man who was already constructing a narrative. Carrick's eyes found Sawyer and held there for a moment before moving to Marlowe, and then Carrick was walking toward them with the stride of a man who had decided he was going to control something. Sawyer recognized the approach. He'd seen versions of it before. Genevieve. Carrick stopped 6 feet away. He'd swept past Sawyer entirely, which was a deliberate choice. Are you all right? I was looking for you. I was in the building, Marlowe said. Sawyer got me out. A brief recalibration behind Carrick's eyes. Good, good, I'm glad you're safe. He paused. We'll need to talk about what happened. We will, Marlowe said. There's going to be an investigation, obviously. And there are some questions about the alarm being pulled without authorization. The containment sequence may have been triggered prematurely by the manual alarm, which means. Blaine, Marlowe said. He stopped. I want to hear what Mr. Rourke has to say first. Carrick turned finally and looked at Sawyer directly. It was the look of a man examining a problem he thought he'd solved and finding it still present. Mr. Rourke, he said, I'm sure you understand that pulling a manual alarm without authorization, triggering an unnecessary evacuation, and accessing restricted areas of the facility are all matters that will need to be addressed formally. Sawyer said, 58 people got out, because of an evacuation that may have been premature. The east wing roofline shifted about 30 minutes ago. The E12 junction ruptured. There is currently steam and smoke rising from a section of the building that had 58 people in it an hour ago. He kept his voice level. If the evacuation was premature, the building didn't get the message. Carrick's jaw tightened. What I'm saying is that the sequence of events, the timeline, the decisions you made, those are going to be examined. And your employment status while that examination takes place. Blaine. Marlowe's voice hadn't changed in volume, but something in its quality shifted. Stop. Carrick stopped. She stood up from the running board, let the foil blanket slide off her shoulders, and faced him directly. She was several inches shorter than him, and she looked, in that moment, not smaller for it. I authorized the partial shutdown, she said. That decision came from me. Whatever the investigation determines about the facility systems, that's on me. And whatever Sawyer did this morning, he did after management at multiple levels declined to act on safety information he'd been raising since midnight. Carrick's expression went through something complicated. Genevieve, you don't have the full I have enough. She said it the same way she'd said it to Sawyer, except this time it wasn't self-assessment. It was something else. I'd like a list of every safety report submitted on the East Wing in the last 12 months, and I'd like it by end of day. All of them. Not a summary of the originals. Carrick looked at her for a moment. That's an operational records request we'd normally go through. End of day, she said. Please. He left. Not quickly, men like Carrick rarely left quickly, because leaving quickly looked like retreat, but he left. Marlowe watched him go. Then she sat back down on the running board. The paper cup in her hands was empty. She looked at it like she'd forgotten it was there. How long ago did you file safety reports? She asked. Sawyer looked at her. How many? She said. 3, he said. Over the past 8 weeks. The first 2 were about the E12 line specifically. The third was about the override protocols, a general flag, about how the manual override authorization was being used. And they were received, they were logged. I got automated confirmation on all 3. But nobody acted on them. I followed up on the first 2 with Paulson. He said they'd been reviewed and cleared. Marlowe was quiet for a moment. By whom? The confirmation said Facility Safety Management. I don't know who that routes to above Paulson. She nodded slowly. Then do you have copies? Personal copies, yeah. Digital, on my home system. Something moved through her expression, not surprise exactly. More like the specific recognition of a fact that changes the shape of other facts around it. Why personal copies? Sawyer considered the question. It was a fair question, and the honest answer wasn't particularly complicated, but it was the kind of answer that revealed something about the way a person had learned to operate in the world. When I was younger, he said, I was in a situation where something important happened, and the official record said it happened differently than it actually did. And the people who could have confirmed the truth didn't have copies of anything. He paused. I've kept my own records since then. Everything. It's just a habit. Marlowe looked at him for a long time, not assessing now or not only assessing. There was something else in the look that Sawyer couldn't fully categorize, and he didn't try to. What do you do, she said, when you're not on nights? It was an unexpected question. I take care of my daughter. How old? 13. What's her name? Emery. Marlowe nodded. She looked back at the facility, the smoke, the emergency crews, the long morning spreading out across the parking lot. The sun was fully up now, burning the haze off the up atmosphere, turning the smoke plume white where it caught the light. Emery's lucky, Marlowe said. Sawyer didn't respond to that directly. He was thinking about the fact that he'd told Emery he'd be home by 8, and it was now he checked his watch, 7:53, and he had no idea when he was going to be able to leave this parking lot, and she was probably already texting him. He pulled out his phone. 3 texts from Emery. The first said, "You coming home?" The second said, "Dad." The third said, "Dad, I made eggs. Don't let them get cold." He typed back, "Running late. Building stuff. Eat the eggs." "I'm okay." A pause then, "What does building stuff mean?" "Exactly what it sounds like. I'll explain later. Eat." Another pause. Then, because she was 13 and couldn't let the last word go to him, "They're already cold." He put the phone back in his pocket and looked up to find Marlowe watching him with an expression he couldn't read. "She okay?" Marlowe asked. Mad about eggs. Something crossed Marlowe's face that might have been the beginning of a smile under different circumstances. She pressed it back. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "I need to ask you to stay on site while the investigation begins. I know you've been here since last night, and I know you were supposed to be home. I know, he said. I'll stay. Thank you. She paused. And I need those safety reports. The originals when you can get them to me. I can email them now if you give me an address. She gave him the address. He sent the 3 reports from his phone, right there, standing in the parking lot with the east wing still breathing smokes into the morning. Guy. She watched her own phone produce the notification. She opened the first report. She read it. Her face, while she read it, went through several things. When she looked up, her expression had settled into something that wasn't quite anger. It was harder than anger and quieter, the specific quality of a person who has just understood that something bad happened that didn't have to. She didn't say anything immediately. Across the lot, an incident command vehicle had pulled in, and Sawyer could see people gathering around it, facility management, emergency coordinators, a few faces he didn't recognize in attire that suggested they weren't from the plant. One of them was in a green uniform that registered in his peripheral vision as military. He looked away. He looked back. 2 of the men in green had stopped near the south gate, about 60 feet away. One of them a senior officer, based on the insignia, though Sawyer was reading it from a distance, and he wasn't in that world anymore, had turned and was looking in their direction. Looking at Sawyer, the man's expression shifted. He said something to the person beside him and then began walking toward the south side of the lot, not hurrying but not wandering either, with the particular purposeful stride of someone who has recognized something and is moving toward it. Sawyer felt something in his chest that he didn't name. He turned back to Marlowe. The 3rd report, he said. The one about the override protocols. Read that one carefully. She was already opening it. He watched her read. He did not look back at the officer approaching from across the parking lot. He was focused on the woman in front of him who was reading the document that was going to change the shape of this entire situation. And he needed her to finish reading it before whatever came next arrived and made the room smaller. She got to the end of the 3rd report. She closed it. She looked up. This was buried, she said. It wasn't a question. That's what it looks like. Someone saw these and marked them resolved. 3 of them. Over 8 weeks. While the production override was being extended, her voice had gone very flat. The flatness of someone doing arithmetic and not liking where it was coming out. The override on the emergency shutdown has been in place, for Blaine put it in for the deadline push, but if it was already being extended when your 2nd report came in. Then the override was already active when I flagged it as a concern, Sawyer said, and someone cleared the report instead of addressing it. She stood up. Not with any visible dramatics. She just stood like a person who has been sitting still for as long as they can and cannot anymore. I need to make some calls, she said. I'll be here, Sawyer said. She looked at him. Thank you, she said, for this morning, for going back in, for the reports. She stopped herself, because she was a person who was comfortable with precision, and the thing she was trying to express didn't fit neatly into precise language. For all of it. He nodded. She walked toward the incident command vehicle, her posture straight, the missing foil blanket leaving a faint silvery deposit on the shoulder of her blazer. She was already dialing when she cleared the 10-foot mark. Sawyer turned around. The senior officer was standing 5 feet behind him. He was a tall man, mid-50s, with the particular physical stillness of someone who had spent a long time training themselves not to move unnecessarily. The uniform was Marine Corps. The rank insignia said Colonel. The face was one that Sawyer knew not well and not recently, but from a specific context that existed in a part of his life he'd filed very carefully away. Rourke, the colonel said. Sawyer said Colonel Ashby. A pause. The colonel looked at him, the coveralls, the soot on his face, the general state of a man who had spent the night monitoring sensors and the morning running back into burning buildings. I heard your name on the radio, Ashby said. Wasn't sure it was the same one. It is. Another pause. You work here. Night maintenance, Sawyer said. 5 years. Ashby looked at the east wing. The smoke was thinning, which probably meant the emergency crews had gotten suppression foam into the main rupture zone. You get everyone out? 58, Sawyer said. All accounted for. Ashby was quiet for a moment. He nodded, once, with the specific quality of a man filing a fact in a place where it would stay. You doing all right? Ashby said. Sawyer thought about Emery's cold eggs. He thought about the 3 safety reports that somebody had buried. He thought about Carrick walking toward him across the parking lot that morning, with the posture of a man already building a case for why whatever happened was someone else's fault. "Working on it," he said. Ashby looked at him steadily. "You always were." Across the lot, someone called the colonel's name and aide, urgent, clipboard in hand. Ashby glanced back, then turned to Sawyer. "I've got to move," he said. "But you and I are going to talk before this day is over." Sawyer didn't say yes or no. He watched Ashby move back toward the command vehicle. He watched him stop and say something to the aide, and the aide write it down, and then Ashby looked back once, not long. Just long enough to confirm the thing he'd been confirming since he walked over, and then he was gone into the organized machinery of the emergency response. Sawyer stood in the parking lot in his soot-covered coveralls in the morning light and thought about nothing in particular for about 30 seconds. Then he went to find Okafor and confirm the count one more time, because that was the kind of man he was. 58. All 58. He walked the perimeter once, accounting for each face by site workers he'd seen every night for years, day shift people he knew by name and by the sound of their boots on the production floor, DeLuca with his arm wrapped in a field bandage, Price sitting on a folding chair with his bad knee elevated. He did not call it anything or assign it any meaning. He just walked and counted, and when the count was right, he stopped. The east wing was still burning somewhere behind its walls, slow and deep, the kind of burn that suppression foam slows but doesn't immediately stop. Sawyer could smell it from where he stood, the specific chemical signature of industrial materials under heat, a smell he associated with nothing good. He'd smelled versions of it before. He knew how to put it in a compartment and leave it there. His phone buzzed. "Emery, Dad, seriously, where are you?" Sawyer, still at work. "Building problem. I'll explain at dinner." "Emery, you keep saying building stuff and building problem." "Dad, what happened?" He looked at the phone for a moment. "Sawyer, something broke. I helped fix it. I'm okay. I'll be home soon." A long pause. Long enough that he almost put the phone away. Then, "Okay, I'll save you some eggs." He smiled at that. It was a small smile, the kind that shows up when you're tired and relieved and not quite ready to let yourself feel the relief completely yet. The kind of smile that doesn't need an audience. He put the phone away and he stayed on the perimeter, and he waited for what came next. Colonel Ashby's aide found Sawyer 40 minutes later, while he was standing at the edge of the medical triage area watching a paramedic finish wrapping DeLuca's forearm. The aide was a young woman, sharp-faced, with a tablet under one arm and the practiced efficiency of someone who had been managing logistics in stressful environments for long enough that stressful environments no longer registered on her face. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "Colonel Ashby would like a few minutes when you're available." "I'm available now. He's finishing with incident command." "Maybe 15 minutes. Fine." Sawyer looked back at DeLuca, who was flexing the wrapped hand experimentally and wincing at the result. "Don't do that," Sawyer said to him. "You'll pull the edges." DeLuca stopped. "How do you know about wound edges?" "I've had a few." DeLuca looked at him the way people had been looking at him all morning, trying to locate something they'd missed earlier. The maintenance tech, the guy who'd been here 5 years, unremarkable, knew where all the panels were, clocked in and clocked out and went home to his kid. DeLuca was 31, maybe, and he had the specific expression of a young man recalculating an assumption he'd been comfortable with. Sawyer didn't explain himself. He thanked the paramedic and walked back toward the south gate. The facility perimeter was organized differently now than it had been an hour ago. Emergency vehicles had repositioned, 2 suppression trucks had moved to the east side of the building, closer to the rupture zone, and the incident command vehicle had been joined by a second one, flying a state emergency management flag. The crowd of workers had thinned as people were processed and released those without injuries, those who'd been accounted for and interviewed and given whatever paperwork the situation required. Some of them had driven away. Some of them were still sitting in their cars in the parking lot, not quite ready to leave, watching the building from behind their windshields. Sawyer understood that. The building was different now. You could see it from here, a section of the east wing's roof line, visibly lower than it should be, the structural steel having given somewhere underneath, the exterior wall on the northeast corner showing a crack that hadn't been there at 6 a.m. The facility would be closed for weeks, probably months. Whether it reopened in its current form was a question that would be answered by engineers and insurers and lawyers, and none of those people were here yet. Blaine Carrick was still on the premises. Sawyer had clocked him twice from a distance once, near the incident command vehicle, talking to two men who had the look of corporate lawyers, despite being dressed like emergency management consultants, and once near the administrative tower entrance, standing slightly apart from the group he was nominally with, working his phone with the focused energy of a man trying to get ahead of something. Sawyer had nothing to say to Carrick right now. If Carrick had things to say to him, that was Carrick's business. He found a stretch of curb near the south gate that was out of the main flow of foot traffic and sat down on it. His body had opinions about sitting down. He'd been on his feet for he checked his watch 9 hours and 40 minutes, and the last time he'd eaten anything was a granola bar at 11 p.m. the night before, which he'd eaten in the car before clocking in, because he'd been running late from Emery's school conference. The conference had run long because Emery's history teacher had things to say about Emery's habit of arguing with primary sources, which was a habit that Sawyer privately found more admirable than problematic, but he'd nodded in the appropriate places. He thought about the conference now, in the way that your mind goes to ordinary things, when the extraordinary things have temporarily subsided. He thought about Emery's face when he'd picked her up afterward, that specific teenage expression of someone who was both pleased and annoyed, because she'd heard him agree with the teacher in the conference room and she was going to make him account for that later. She had a gift for making him account for things. His phone buzzed again. Not Emery this time, a number he didn't recognize, local area code. He answered it, Mr. Rourke, a woman's voice, efficient not unkind. This is Dr. Lena Ferris with the County Emergency Management Office. I'm coordinating the incident response with the facility, and I have a few questions about the timeline of events this morning. Is now a good time? Fine, Sawyer said. She asked him questions for 22 minutes. He answered them the same way. He'd answered everything all morning specifically, without embellishment, with timestamps where he had them, and approximations where he didn't. He told her about the sensor readings. He told her about Hirsch and the escalation that went nowhere. He told her about the decision to pull the alarm, the evacuation sequence, the containment barrier, the service corridor. He told her about finding Marlowe and DeLuca and Price at the junction corridor entrance. She listened. She asked follow-up questions that were precise enough that he revised his initial impression of her from efficient to sharp. When he mentioned the override log Carrick's authorization at 6:40 p.m. the previous evening, she paused her typing. You saw the override log yourself? She said. On the central monitoring terminal at the south end of the east wing. Timestamp 1840. Authorization code under Blaine Carrick's executive credentials. And you flagged this to your duty manager. At approximately 12:50 a.m. Yes. Do you recall the duty manager's response? He said it was above his authority to override a COO-level authorization. He said he'd make a note of it. Another pause. Mr. Rourke, were you aware at that point that the override had been renewed? Not placed that evening, but renewed. Sawyer stopped. Say that again. The override on the East Wing emergency shutdown. Our preliminary review of the facility records suggests that it wasn't placed for the first time yesterday evening. It appears to have been in continuous active status for approximately 11 weeks, being renewed at regular intervals under executive authorization. Sawyer was quiet for a moment. No, he said. I didn't know that. The override log you accessed, would it have shown the renewal history, or only the most recent authorization? He thought back to the terminal screen, the entry he'd seen. The timestamp, the credentials, the single line of text. Most recent only, he said. The history would be in the full administrative log. I don't have access to that, I see. She was typing again. Thank you, Mr. Rourke. I may have additional questions later. He ended the call and sat for a moment with the phone in his hand. 11 weeks. The override had been running for 11 weeks. His first safety report flagging the E12 pressure line had been submitted 9 weeks ago, which meant that when someone in the facility's safety management chain had received his report and marked it reviewed and cleared, the emergency shutdown had already been disabled for 2 weeks. Someone had read his report, understood what it was flagging, and cleared it anyway. With the shutdown disabled. With the production line running. He put the phone in his pocket and pressed the heels of both hands against his knees, feeling the fatigue in his forearms that he'd been ignoring for the past hour. The anger was there. He was aware of it. But he'd learned, a long time ago, that anger and isolation was just noise. It had to go somewhere useful, or it went somewhere destructive. And right now there was work still to be done, and he needed to stay functional for it. So he filed the anger in the same place he filed other things that couldn't be addressed immediately. And he sat on the curb, and he waited for Ashby. Ashby came 12 minutes later. He pulled a folding chair from somewhere the incident command vehicle, probably, and set it on the tarmac, 2 feet from where Sawyer was sitting, and lowered himself into it with the care of a man whose knees had logged too many hard miles. "You look terrible," Ashby said. "Been a long night." "Tell me about it." Ashby wasn't asking about the night specifically. He was asking about all of it, the sequence, the decisions, the outcome. He had that quality Sawyer had always respected in him, the ability to ask large questions, small words. Sawyer told him. He was more relaxed in the telling than he'd been with Dr. Ferris, because Ashby was someone who already understood the framework, who knew what it meant to read an environment, who knew the difference between a risk that could be managed and one that had already escaped management. He didn't have to translate. When he finished, Ashby was quiet for a moment. "You went back in," Ashby said. 3 people were inside. "You didn't know that when you went back in. You knew someone was inside." "Same thing." Ashby looked at him. "Rourke, you've got a kid at home." "I know that. And you went back into a building that was in active structural failure. I knew the service corridor. I knew the exit routes. It wasn't—" He stopped, because the next word he'd been reaching for was irrational, and that wasn't quite right either. "I'd been in worse," he said, "and I knew this building." Ashby rubbed the side of his jaw. "You did. 5 years of nights. You'd know every inch. That's what let me move fast enough." Another silence. A longer one, the kind Ashby used to let things settle. "You still running?" he said. "And the SEAL network never reached out to you? After you separated?" "A few times. Early on, you said no." I said no. Ashby nodded. He wasn't pressing it. He hadn't pressed it when Sawyer had separated from the service 8 years ago, and he wasn't pressing it now. Of all the things Sawyer appreciated about the man, the absence of pressure was near the top of the list. "Emery's 13 now," Ashby said. "Yeah, she know you're here?" "She knows I'm late and she's mad about eggs." Ashby made a sound that was close to a laugh. He looked at the facility, the East Wing, the smoke, and his expression was the expression of a man who had spent a long career looking at the aftermath of things and had made his peace with the fact that he would keep having to look. "The Marines came in for perimeter support," Ashby said. "Reserve unit doing emergency management training nearby. Coordinating with county on the response." He paused. "Lucky, in a sense." "Lucky," Sawyer agreed. "Genevieve Marlowe," Ashby said. The name had a different texture coming from him, careful, like he was placing it. "You know who she is, beyond today?" "CEO of Ashcroft. First on-site visit. Before Ashcroft, she ran operations at Mercer Industrial. Before that, she was at Halston Group." He paused. "She's not a figurehead. She built things. When things went wrong at Halston, she was the one who went in and actually fixed them, not just changed the personnel and relaunched the PR." He looked at Sawyer. "I'm telling you this because the conversation you two had this morning, the reports, the override timeline, that's going to matter. She's going to do something with it. I got that impression. Make sure your documentation is complete. Already sent her copies." Ashby was quiet for a moment. "Then of course you did." He said it without irony, just recognition. He stood, joints protesting audibly. "I've got to get back to command. But I want your contact information updated before you leave today." He pulled a card from his breast pocket and held it out. "My direct line, not the office, my direct line." Sawyer took the card. He looked at it, a plain white card, Colonel D. Ashby, the direct number, nothing else. No department, no unit designation, just the number. "All right," Sawyer said. Ashby put out his hand. Sawyer shook it. The colonel held it a beat longer than a formal handshake required, which was its own kind of thing, and then he turned and walked back toward Incident Command. Sawyer looked at the card for a moment. Then he put it in the chest pocket of his coveralls against his phone. The mornings stretched into late morning and then into afternoon, the way long incidents do, time moving strangely fast in the moments of action and viscously slow in the waiting between them. The fire suppression teams worked through the morning on the East Wing, and by 11 a.m. the visible smoke had reduced to a thin gray column that bent south in the wind. At noon, a structural engineering team arrived from the city, and began a preliminary exterior assessment of the affected section, walking the perimeter with equipment and clipboards and the particular focused silence of people who are looking at a building the way a doctor looks at an X-ray. The County Emergency Management Office had set up a formal interview station near the incident command vehicle, and workers were being processed through it in small groups, brief recorded statements, contact information, instructions about accessing employee support resources. Sawyer gave his formal statement at 10:15. He was in the interview station for 40 minutes, which was longer than most because the interviewer, a man named Hollis, thorough and humorless, who took notes by hand in a small notebook, wanted to go through the timeline in granular detail. Sawyer went through it twice. He didn't elaborate beyond what was asked, and he didn't editorialize. And when Hollis asked him to characterize the COO's response to his concerns, Sawyer described what had been said as accurately as he could and declined to add interpretive framing. Hollis noted that. Afterward, Sawyer stood outside the interview station and ate half a sandwich from the food table the facility had set up for workers and emergency personnel turkey, mustard, gone slightly warm in its wrapper, one of the best things he'd eaten in recent memory. He was finishing it when Marlowe found him. She'd changed out of the blazer. Someone had produced a facility-branded fleece jacket, the kind kept in bulk for visitors and new hires, and she'd put it on over her dress shirt, which made her look somewhat less like a CEO and somewhat more like a person who'd had a hard morning, which was accurate. Her hair was fully back in whatever it had been in when the morning started. She held a tablet in one hand and her phone in the other, and she moved with the specific compressed energy of a person managing 6 things simultaneously and choosing for this moment to stop. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "do you have a few minutes?" "I've had all day," he said. She almost smiled at that. She gestured toward a stretch of wall along the administrative tower, out of the main flow, enough distance from the nearest group of people to have a conversation without it being overheard. They walked to it. She leaned against the wall. He stood. "I spoke with Dr. Ferris," Marlowe said, "emergency management. She told me about the override renewal history." "She told me too," Sawyer said. "This morning. 11 weeks. She said it the way you say a number, when you're still doing what it means. The override was in continuous active status for 11 weeks. Your first report was 9 weeks ago. Yeah, and your second report was 5 weeks ago. Your third was 2 weeks ago." She looked at him. All 3 were cleared without action. During an active override of the emergency shutdown. That's what it looks like. That's what it is. Her voice had the flatness again, the arithmetic voice. "Blaine's authorization is on the override renewal log. Every renewal, over 11 weeks. And the facility safety management clearances on your reports." She paused. "I'm going to need you to understand that I'm about to tell you something I'm not supposed to tell you yet, because the formal investigation hasn't confirmed it, but I think you've earned it. Okay. The clearances on your safety reports route to a specific inbox in the operations chain. That inbox is managed by Blaine's administrative team. The clearances were processed, signed off, without ever being escalated to the actual safety engineering department." Sawyer said nothing. "They went into the inbox," Marlowe said. "They were marked reviewed. They came back out with cleared status. And nobody with safety engineering credentials ever looked at them." He let that sit for a moment. The anger was back, the same anger he'd filed away earlier, except now it had specific weight and shape. 3 reports, 9 weeks of specific documented warning. 3 times someone had looked at those warnings and made a decision to clear them and keep the production line running. "Do you know who?" he said. "Not yet. The investigation will determine that." She paused. "But the audit trail on the clearances is clear. Whoever processed them made a choice." "They made it 3 times, Sawyer said. "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "I want you to know that I intend to follow this wherever it goes. I need you to trust that." He considered her. He'd been reading people his entire adult life, a skill that had been systematically developed over years of training and then refined over years of actual application, in situations where misreading someone had direct consequences. Marlowe had the quality he associated with people who said what they meant, not because they were incapable of dishonesty, but because they'd made a decision at some point that it wasn't worth the maintenance. "I trust it," he said. She nodded. Something shifted in her posture, not relaxation exactly, more like a small recalibration. I also want to talk to you about your position here, she said. He waited. Formally speaking, what you did this morning was unauthorized. You pulled a manual alarm without executive authorization. You accessed a restricted maintenance corridor without logging it. You re-entered a compromised facility after the evacuation had begun. She was watching him carefully. All of that is technically in violation of facility protocol. I know, and all of it saved 3 lives and likely prevented additional casualties in the time it gave the containment response to operate. She paused. I need you to understand that I'm not going to let the technical violations be used against you. I'm telling you now clearly, so there's no ambiguity. Whatever Blaine tries to argue about your conduct this morning, that's not where this ends up. He nodded. He hadn't been certain of that, and he'd been carrying the uncertainty in a back compartment all morning without fully acknowledging it. Hearing it said directly was useful. What I'm more interested in, Marlowe said, is what comes next. Before he could respond to that, his phone went off. Not a text, a call, the ringtone he'd set specifically for the school, a flat double ring that he'd trained himself to treat as a priority. Sorry, he said. I need to take this, of course. He stepped 2 paces away and answered. It was the school's administrative office, a woman named Mrs. Patel, who Sawyer had spoken to on approximately 12 occasions over 3 years, because Emery generated situations that required administrative phone calls at a rate disproportionate to her size. Mr. Rourke, Mrs. Patel said, I'm sorry to bother you. Emery's fine, nothing's wrong, but she's been asking the front office to call you since about 11 o'clock, and we told her you were likely unavailable, and she's been a small pause. Persistent. He pinched the bridge of his nose. Can you put her on? A brief hold, the sound of the phone being transferred, and then Emery's voice, 13 years old, with the specific forced casualness of someone who has been worried and is deeply committed to not showing it. Hey, she said. Hey, he said. Mrs. Patel said you were unavailable. I was. I'm available now. What happened? It wasn't a question. She'd been asking what happened since the first text that morning, and she'd accepted his non-answers with the patience of someone who knows they'll get the real answer eventually, but the patience had apparently run its course. Something broke at the plant, he said. There was an evacuation. I helped. A pause. Like a fire? Like a pressure failure in the East Wing. Structural issue. It's being handled. Were you in it? He considered the question, and Emery's gift for precision. For a bit, he said. Dad, I'm standing in a parking lot, he said. I'm fine. I'm a little tired, and I haven't eaten enough, and I still need to finish talking to some people. But I'm fine. Another pause, longer. He could hear her breathing on the other end, and the ambient noise of what sounded like the school hallway lockers, distant voices, someone's sneakers on linoleum. Okay, she said finally. Okay, he said. Are you actually okay, or are you saying okay, so I stop asking? He thought about the service corridor, the door that wouldn't open, the sound the building had made when the containment barrier dropped. Both, he said, but more the first one. That's not reassuring, Dad. I know. I'll explain tonight, dinner. I made eggs this morning, she said. They got cold, I heard. He paused. I'll make something tonight. Your call, a beet pasta, she said, the good kind. Done, with the breadcrumbs on top, emery and parmesan. Emery. Okay, he could hear the smile in it, small and reluctant, and there. Come home. He ended the call and stood for a moment before turning back to Marlowe, who had been looking at the facility during the call, with the focused attention of a woman who was very deliberately not listening. Sorry, he said. Don't be. She looked at him. Emery. Yeah. She was worried. She's always worried. She just has a lot of opinions about it. Marlowe looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't sentiment. It was closer to recognition, the specific quality of someone seeing a thing that they understand from the inside without having experienced exactly that version of it. You were saying, he said. What comes next? She refocused. I want to make a proposal. I'm not asking for an answer today. I'm aware that today isn't the right day for it, and I'm aware that you've had a night and a morning that would leave most people unable to think clearly about anything. She paused. But I want to say it now, on record, so that you understand where I stand. He waited. Ashcroft needs a director of facility safety and emergency operations, she said. Not the position that currently exists on the org chart, which is effectively a compliance role with no authority to stop production. A real position. one with direct authority to suspend production in any wing if safety thresholds are breached. Direct reporting line to me. Mandate to rebuild the safety culture from the incident reporting level up. He was quiet for a moment. That's a significant role, he said. Yes, I'm a maintenance technician. You're a former Navy SEAL with specialized emergency response experience who spent 5 years learning this facility from the inside out and submitted 3 increasingly urgent safety reports that the people above. You buried. She said it evenly, without performance. That's not a maintenance technician. That's the person I should have had in this role before today. He didn't say anything. He was looking at the east wing, the structural damage, the thin smoke, the engineering team moving along the perimeter with their clipboards. The plant that had 58 people in it this morning and was now empty and would stay empty for a long time. What does the schedule look like? He said. She blinked. It wasn't the response she'd been expecting, or at least not the first one. What? The schedule, the position. Is it a standard executive schedule? 12-hour days, evening calls, quarterly travel. She studied him. Why? Because I have a 13-year-old at home who I'm the only parent of. And I took the night maintenance shift specifically because it let me be there when she needed me. If this position puts me back on a schedule where I'm not home until 8 p.m. and I'm flying somewhere every 6 weeks. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Something moved through Marlowe's expression. Not surprised she didn't look like someone who surprised easily. More like a fact landing in the right place. I can build the position around reasonable hours, she said. I can give you authority without requiring you to be available at all hours. That's a structural choice, not a limitation of the role. She paused. I'm not going to lie to you and say there won't be crises that require extra time. That happens in every safety role. But the baseline, the day-to-day, I can design that so it works for your life. If you tell me what that looks like. He looked at her. Why? Why what? Why would you do that? Most executive offers don't come with schedule flexibility built in at the proposal stage. She held his gaze. Because the right person for this job is someone who understands that the people on that production floor have lives they're going home to. Families, schedules, things that matter more than the job. She paused. A person who doesn't understand that won't build a safety culture that works. They'll build another version of Blaine's compliance theater. Sawyer was quiet. Also, she said with less formality, you went back into a building for 3 people you didn't know particularly well, and then the first thing you did when you got out was confirm the head count. And the second thing you did was answer a text from your kid about eggs. She paused. That tells me something. He didn't respond to that. He was thinking about Emery and pasta with breadcrumbs, and the conversation they were going to have tonight that he'd need to calibrate carefully, specific enough that she'd feel informed, general enough that she'd sleep. He was also thinking, with a clarity that surprised him, that he was very tired and not equipped to make a large decision standing in a parking lot on no sleep and half a sandwich, and that Marlowe had said she wasn't asking for an answer today, and that the only correct response to that was to take her at her word. I appreciate the proposal, he said. I'll think about it. She nodded. She'd expected that, he could tell. She wasn't disappointed by it. Take whatever time you need. I won't take long. I know. She shifted the tablet under her arm. Go home, Mr. Rourke. You've been here since yesterday. There's still. The investigation has your statement. Emergency management has your contact information. The facility engineers don't need you for the structural assessment. And Dr. Ferris has your number. She looked at him directly. Go home. Eat pasta. Talk to your daughter. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, all right. He collected his things from the equipment room, his bag, his personal log, the tablet, the thermos he'd brought from home the previous night that was still sitting in his locker because he'd never had a chance to open it. He signed out with the security desk, which felt strange given the state of the building. But Denny was there at the desk regardless, crossword abandoned, looking at Sawyer, with an expression that contained about 8 different things at once. Hell of a morning, Denny said. Yeah, you doing all right? Working on it. Denny looked at him for another second, then said, You want coffee? I've got the machine going back here. Sawyer thought about the thermos, still full and cold. No thanks, he said. I've got somewhere to be. He walked to his car. The lot had thinned significantly. Most workers had gone home. The emergency vehicles had consolidated to the east side, and the late afternoon light was hitting the facility at an angle that made the structural damage on the east wing look both worse and somehow more abstract, like a photograph of something rather than the thing itself. He sat in the car for a moment before starting it. His hands were on the steering wheel, and he was looking at the building, and he was doing the thing he sometimes did after the operational part of something ended, and the quiet arrived, running through the decisions, the timeline, the moments where the choice tree had branched differently. The 12:50 a.m. conversation with Hirsch. The point on the production floor when he decided to stop arguing and start counting heads instead. The 10 seconds at the emergency alarm panel when he'd stood with the broken cover in his hand, knowing exactly what that pull meant for his employment and doing it anyway. He didn't spend long on it. He was too tired for the full accounting, and the full accounting could wait. He started the car. He'd been driving for 4 minutes, moving through the late afternoon traffic toward the route home, when his phone lit up on the passenger seat. Not a call, a news alert, the local station, the headline appearing in abbreviated form across the top of the screen. He glanced at it at a red light. Ashcroft Dynamics incident, sources say buried safety reports preceded explosion facility coup under scrutiny. He read it twice. Then the light changed and he put his eyes back on the road and he drove. His phone buzzed again. Text from Emery, I saw the news. Dad, that was your building. He drove another block. Then he pulled over briefly, typed, yes, I'm in the car. Home in 20 minutes. Don't watch the news. Her reply came in 4 seconds. Oh my God, Dad. Then are you actually okay? Then I'm making pasta, don't argue. He pulled back into traffic. The late afternoon light was going golden on the storefronts and the road signs and the ordinary shapes of the city that had been existing at its normal pace all day while the facility had been doing what it had been doing. He felt the weight of the shift in his arms and his back, and behind his eyes, the accumulated physical cost of 9+ hours, something that required more than ordinary maintenance work. But underneath it, quieter and more durable, was something else. 58 people. All 58 accounted for and alive and home or on their way. DeLuca with his wrapped arm, Price with his elevated knee. Marlowe in her facility fleece, reading his 3 buried safety reports on her phone in a parking lot, and letting her face show what she was thinking. He thought about what she'd said, that Emery was lucky. He didn't know if that was right exactly. Lucky implied the outcome was in the hands of chance. Sawyer had made a decision, 8 years ago, to structure his entire life around being present for his daughter, and it hadn't been lucky, it had been deliberate, and it had cost him things, and he'd make the same decision again without hesitation. Emery wasn't lucky. Emery was the result of a choice her father had made every day, including the choice to take the night shift, including the choice to go home to cold eggs, including the choice to pull the alarm this morning when everyone with authority had decided not to. He turned onto his street. The house was at the end of a residential block, a modest house, nothing remarkable, with a maple tree in the front yard that had been losing leaves since mid-September in a way that was going to require raking soon. The porch light was on. Through the front window he could see the kitchen light and the particular warm shadow of someone moving around in it. Emery, making pasta, apparently, without his input. He parked and sat for one more moment. He was very tired. His hands were still not entirely clean. There was grime in the creases of his knuckles that hadn't come out in the facility bathroom sink, and his coveralls had soot on them that would never entirely wash out. And he could still smell the particular chemical trace of the east wing somewhere in his clothes. He got out of the car. The front door opened before he reached it. Emery, who had been watching for headlights because she would never admit she was watching for headlights, but she always was. She was wearing an oversized sweatshirt with a hole in the sleeve cuff, and her hair was back in something that had mostly escaped its own elastic, and she looked at him in the way she'd looked at him's, since she was small that particular assessment. That meant she was checking for damage and trying to look like she wasn't. She looked at his face. She looked at the soot on his coveralls. Dad, she said. Hey, he said. She stepped back to let him in. He crossed the threshold, and she closed the door behind him, and then 13 years old, too old for this. Fully aware that she was too old for this, and doing it anyway, she put her arms around him from behind while he was still taking his shoes off, her chin against his shoulder. He straightened up and put one hand over both of hers. They stood like that for a moment, in the front hallway, The house warm around them, the smell of pasta sauce coming from the kitchen. "Water's almost boiling," she said, muffled against his jacket. "Okay, you need a shower, I know. The sauce has been going for an hour. I may have over-seasoned it. We'll manage." She didn't let go immediately. He didn't either. They stayed in that configuration for another few seconds, which was long enough, and then she pulled back and said, with the studied casualness of a 13-year-old reestablishing her dignity, "Okay, go shower. You smell like a building." He looked at her. She was looking at the middle distance, her arms crossed now, thoroughly composed. "Thanks for making dinner," he said. "Don't make it weird," she said. 20 minutes or the pasta overcooks. He went upstairs. Through the bathroom window, as the water heated, he could see the maple tree in the front yard, the last of the evening light on its leaves. He stood under the shower until the water ran clear and the smell of the facility was gone, and he thought about nothing and everything. And by the time he came downstairs again, the pasta was done, and Emery had set the table, and the over-seasoned sauce turned out, when he tasted it, to be exactly right. He slept 10 hours that night, which was 2 hours more than he'd slept in a single stretch in recent memory, and he woke at 6:15 to Emery's alarm going off down the hall and the ordinary sounds of a Thursday morning water running, a drawer closing too hard, the specific thud of Emery locating her backpack by dropping it on the floor rather than picking it up from where she'd left it. He lay there for a moment, listening to the sounds of the house, and let the previous day arrange itself in his memory. It had a different quality in the morning light than it had in the parking lot or in the car on the way home. Cleaner edges. He could look at the pieces of it more steadily now that the fatigue wasn't sitting on top of everything. He got up before Emery made it downstairs, started the coffee, and was scrambling eggs when she appeared in the kitchen doorway, with her hair half done and one shoe already on. She looked at the eggs. She looked at him. "You didn't have to," she said.
"I know."
She sat at the table. She put the other shoe on, tying it with the focused attention of someone giving herself something to do with her hands, while she thought about what she actually wanted to say. Sawyer had watched her do this her entire life. She got it from her mother, that particular habit of using physical tasks to manage the gap between feeling something and finding the words for it. "So," she said to her shoelace. "So," he said. "The news said they found buried safety reports." "Where are you getting the news?" "My phone, Dad. Like everyone." He put the eggs on the table and poured 2 mugs of coffee, his black, hers, with enough milk to make it technically a different beverage, and sat across from her. She looked up. "Tell me," she said. It was the same voice she'd used since she was 9, when she'd figured out that tell me worked better than what happened, because it didn't give him room to say nothing. So he told her. Not everything he left out, the specific details of the service corridor and the door that hadn't opened, because there were things a 13-year-old didn't need to visualize about her father's morning. But he told her about the readings, about Hirsch, about the production floor and the alarm. He told her about the containment barrier and finding Marlowe and DeLuca and Price. When he got to the part about going back in, he didn't soften it. She would know if he softened it. Emery listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. She ate approximately half her eggs. Her coffee went mostly untouched. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You went back in," she said. "Yes, after you were out." "Yes," she looked at him. She had her mother's eyes direct, a little unsettling in how much they held at once. Why? It was the same question Ashby had asked, and Marlowe, in her way, had asked, and Sawyer had given versions of the same answer to both of them. But Emery wasn't asking for a professional rationale or a tactical explanation. She was asking the actual question, the one underneath the practical one, and she was 13, and she deserved the actual answer. "Because there were people in there," he said, "and I knew the building. And I could. That's 3 different reasons, yeah." Which one was first? He considered that. The people, he said. The other 2 were just what made it possible. She held his gaze for another beat. Then she picked up her fork and ate the rest of her eggs without saying anything else, which was its own kind of answer. He didn't push it. Some things she needed to sit with, and she knew it, and he knew it, and they'd developed over years the particular ease of 2 people comfortable with a quiet room. "The news said the COO might be in trouble," she said, eventually. "There's an investigation. It'll determine what happened. But those reports, they were buried. That's what it looks like." She absorbed this. And you reported it 3 times.
Yes.
She was quiet again. Then that makes me so angry. Me too, he said. What are you going to do? Cooperate with the investigation. Do what they ask. And the position she offered you. She said it casually, as if she'd known about it all along, which she hadn't, which meant she'd been paying close enough attention during last night's conversation to pick up the thing he'd mentioned once, briefly, while she was allegedly focused on pouring sauce. He looked at her. She looked back, composed, waiting. I'm thinking about it, he said. What's to think about? Schedule. Responsibility. Whether I can do the job without it taking over everything else. She considered this seriously, the way she considered things she'd already thought about from multiple angles. Would it pay more? Emery. That's not a bad question, Dad. It's not the first question. Okay, but is it a good job? Does it actually, would it matter? Would you be doing something real? He looked at his coffee mug. Yeah, he said, it would be real. Then think faster, she said, and stood up to clear her plate, and that was the end of that part of the conversation. He walked her to the corner at 7:55. She had her earbuds in before they hit the sidewalk, but she pulled one out for the half block where the neighbors had a dog she'd been having a long-running friendship with around. Enthusiastic beagle named Waffle, who pressed himself against the fence and wagged his entire body when she appeared. She crouched down and let him sniff her hand through the chain link, and Sawyer stood on the sidewalk and watched her do it, and felt the specific feeling that he'd never found an adequate word for the feeling of watching your kid be a person in the world, ordinary and complete, going about the small business of her life. She stood, put the earbud back in, and looked at him. Breadcrumbs, she said. What? On the pasta last night. You forgot the breadcrumbs. He hadn't forgotten. He'd run out. I'll get them today. And the parmesan. I have parmesan. The good parmesan. In the block. Emery. She was already walking, her backpack listing slightly to one side as it always did when she'd packed too many books. She raised one hand in a backward wave without turning around, and then she was at the corner, and then she was gone. Sawyer walked back to the house. He made a second cup of coffee and stood at the kitchen window and drank it, and then he called Colonel Ashby. Ashby picked up on the second ring. Rourke, he said. How'd you sleep? Better than I expected. Good. You needed it. A pause. You see the news? Emery showed me. It's moving fast. The State Emergency Management Report is going to be public by end of week. The preliminary findings are, Ashby paused. Not good for Carrick. What are they finding? That the override renewal was systematically tied to production deadline cycles. Every time a major deadline was coming, the override got renewed. 11 weeks covers 3 separate production deadline periods. A beat. And the safety report clearances the investigation has identified, whose credentials were used to mark them reviewed. One of Blaine's operations managers, woman named Croft. They're interviewing her today. Sawyer turned away from the window and sat at the kitchen table. Did Carrick know she was clearing them without escalation? The investigation will determine that. But the pattern, the timeline of the clearances against the override renewals, against the production deadlines, it's going to be hard to argue he didn't know the reports were coming in, and harder to argue the clearances were coincidental. He knew, Sawyer said. Probably, Ashby said. But probably doesn't get anyone fired from a senior executive position at a publicly traded company. Evidence does. How's the evidence looking? Ask me in 3 days. Sawyer was quiet for a moment. Marlowe offered me a position. Ashby was quiet on his end for exactly long enough that it wasn't silence it was considered. Director of Safety and Emergency Operations, Sawyer said. Real authority. Direct reporting line to her. She said she'd build the schedule around reasonable hours. And I'm thinking about it. What's the obstacle? Emery said the same thing. Ashby made a sound that was genuinely close to a laugh. Smart kid. She is. He turned the coffee mug in his hands. It's a significant change. I've been in the same role for 5 years. I know what it is. I know what my days look like. You will also know what it looks like when those days aren't enough to change something that needs changing, Ashby said. It wasn't a push, it was a fact, offered the way Ashby offered most facts cleanly, without decoration. Yeah, Sawyer said. I'm not going to tell you what to do. But I'll tell you what I see from where I'm standing. A pause. The investigation is going to produce a report. That report is going to recommend structural changes to how South Safety operations work at that facility. Marlowe will implement those changes. The question is whether the person implementing them is someone who actually understands what went wrong and why, or another set of credentials filling a newly created position. He paused again. You know what went wrong. I know this facility. You know more than the facility, he said it evenly. You know how it goes when the right information is in the wrong person's hands. You've been on both sides of that. Sawyer didn't respond immediately. He thought about a different facility, years ago, in a different context, a situation where he'd been the person with information and no authority, and the outcome had been the kind that left marks. He didn't think about it often. He'd put it where he put things like that, filed under understood and finished, and he didn't take it out unnecessarily. But it had shaped the habit of keeping his own records, and the habit of reading environments, and the particular tension he'd felt at 12:50 a.m. standing at the control terminal and seeing the override log for the first time. All right, he said. All right, you'll take it? Or all right, you're thinking about it? All right, I hear you. Ashby accepted that. Call me when you decide. The formal request for Sawyer's continued cooperation with the state investigation arrived by email at 9:15 a.m. from Dr. Ferris's office. It was professional and specific. They wanted him available for a second interview, later in the week. They wanted copies of any additional personal documentation he had related to the East Wing safety concerns. And they wanted to verify the chain of custody on his original 3 safety reports before they went into the formal evidentiary record. He responded, attached the documentation they'd requested, his personal maintenance logs, time-stamped, dating back 14 months, and then he drove to the grocery store and bought a block of good Parmesan and a bag of panko breadcrumbs and came home and put them on the counter. He sat at the kitchen table for a while, not doing anything specific. It was strange, being home in the daylight. 5 years of night shifts meant that the house in daytime had a quality he'd never entirely gotten comfortable with, the light coming through the windows at angles he wasn't used to. The sounds of the neighborhood that he slept through on the days he was supposed to sleep. The school bus passing at 3:20, kids on bikes. Someone 3 houses down with a leaf blower that appeared every other Thursday. He existed in these daytime hours rarely and imperfectly. He always felt slightly out of phase with them. His phone rang at 11:40. The number belonged to the facility's HR director, a woman named Angela Pyers, who had a careful professional voice that was currently under strain. Mr. Rourke, she said, I want to be transparent with you about where things stand from an HR perspective. You are still technically an active employee, and your employment status is under review in light of the events of yesterday. Okay, he said. I want to be clear that this review is standard procedure in any incident involving unauthorized use of emergency equipment and unapproved building reentry. It doesn't reflect a determination about your conduct. Marlowe told me yesterday that she wouldn't let those violations be used against me. A pause. Ms. Marlowe has communicated her position on that matter internally. I'm aware of it. Another pause, shorter. I'm calling because I wanted you to hear directly from HR that we are not proceeding with any disciplinary process at this time. The review is paused pending the outcome of the state investigation. Appreciated. And I want to say personally, Mr. Rourke, not on behalf of the department. I processed your maintenance personnel file this morning while I was pulling your records. I saw your employment history, your performance reviews, your tenure. A pause. All 5 of those performance reviews say the same thing. Does his job adequately. Every one of them. That's all anyone ever wrote. He didn't say anything. I thought you should know, she said, that I found that inadequate. He thanked her and ended the call. He sat for a moment in the kitchen and thought about 5 performance reviews that said adequately, and the gap between what that word described and what the previous 24 hours had looked like, and whether those 2 things existed in any relationship to each other, or were simply parallel facts about the same person viewed from different distances. He decided they were parallel facts. The people who'd written those reviews weren't wrong. Exactly, he had done his job, and he hadn't gone out of his way to perform beyond it, or to make himself visible, because visibility wasn't why he was there. He was there for the schedule. He was there for Emery. And then the situation had become one where the schedule didn't matter, and visibility didn't matter, and the only thing that mattered was that he was the person who knew the building and the people who needed to get out of it, and adequate had nothing to do with what happened next. He thought about what Ashby had said. You know how it goes when the right information is in the wrong person's hands. He picked up his phone and texted Marlowe. I'd like to discuss the position further when you have time this week. Her reply came 11 minutes later, tomorrow, 10 a.m. Coffee. I'll send the address. The second interview with the state investigation took place on Friday afternoon, in a conference room at the County Emergency Management Office, a deliberately neutral space, which Sawyer appreciated. Dr. Ferris was present, along with a second investigator named Holt, who had the background of someone who'd spent time on accident reconstruction and whose questions had the specific texture of someone building a sequence, not just collecting statements. Holt walked him through the sensor readings with the kind of granular precision that told Sawyer the investigation had already been inside the facility's monitoring system and knew what it had found there. He wasn't asking to learn, he was asking to verify and to add Sawyer's direct observation to what the data already showed. Sawyer answered everything straight. Timestamps, panel numbers, the exact language Hirsch had used, the exact language Carrick had used. When Holt asked him to describe his decision-making process at the moment he pulled the alarm, Sawyer described it without editorializing. He had assessed that the sensor pattern indicated an imminent failure event, that the window for a safe evacuation was closing, that the management chain had declined to act, and that the only remaining option that could affect the outcome was the manual alarm. At what point, Holt said, did you determine that the situation exceeded your authority to act? I determined that when I spoke to Hirsch at 12:50, he was the appropriate escalation point and he exercised his judgment. Above Hirsch, I didn't have a path, and yet you acted above your authority. I did. Walk me through that decision. Sawyer looked at him steadily. The alternative was not acting. I ran the math on what not acting looked like. 58 people on that floor, with a pressure line that had been escalating for 7 hours and an emergency shutdown that was disabled. He paused. I've been in situations before where the choice was between acting outside your authority and not acting. I know what the second option costs. In your military experience, Holt said. Yes. Can you be more specific? I'd rather not. It's not relevant to the event at this facility. Holt looked at him. He made a note. The investigation may want to explore that further. The investigation can make that request through proper channels, Sawyer said. What's relevant here is the sensor data, the override log, and the safety reports. All of which I've provided. Holt accepted that. He moved on. At the end of the interview, Ferris asked him to stay for a few minutes while Holt packaged his notes. She closed the conference room door and sat across from him with the directness of someone who has set aside the professional framework for a moment. The investigation is going to conclude within 2 weeks, she said. The preliminary findings are they're significant. The override renewal pattern, the safety report clearances, the timeline. It's going to be a hard report for this company. I know, he said. There will likely be regulatory consequences beyond the internal investigation. State Safety Board, possibly federal OSHA review, she paused. Your documentation, the personal logs, the time-stamped reports, they're going to be central to that record. Good, he said. She looked at him for a moment. You don't have an attorney? Should I? People in your position sometimes find it useful. My position being? Whistleblower, central witness. Someone whose documentation may be the clearest chain of evidence in a significant industrial safety case. She said it matter-of-factly. I'm not trying to alarm you. I'm saying your interest in this process may benefit from representation. He thought about it. I'll make some calls. Good, she stood. And Mr. Rourke, the documentation you maintained. The personal logs, the separate copies of the reports. She paused. That's not common. Most workers, even the careful ones, don't do that. I know. Why did you? He looked at her. Because I've watched things disappear before. The kind of things that only stayed real because someone kept a copy. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, the way people nod when something confirms what they already suspected. The coffee meeting with Marlowe was at a place downtown, not corporate, not impressive, a narrow cafe with mismatched chairs, and the kind of coffee that tasted like the beans had been treated seriously. She was there when he arrived, 10 minutes early, with her laptop open and a half-finished espresso in front of her. She closed the laptop when she saw him and moved the espresso to the side. She looked better than she had in the parking lot. Less like someone in active crisis management, more like someone who had been in active crisis management and was currently managing the aftermath with focused intention. She had the kind of face that wore exhaustion as sharpness rather than softness. The fatigue made her more precise, not less. "Mr. Rourke," she said. "Sawyer's fine," he said. She nodded. "Sawyer." She pushed a menu toward him. "Get something." "You probably haven't eaten. I had breakfast. It's 10:15. "I eat early." She looked at him with a mild expression that said she didn't entirely believe him, but wasn't going to argue about it. He ordered coffee and, because she was clearly waiting for it, a piece of toast. They talked for 2 hours. Not 2 hours of formality. The formal offer would come through official channels, and they both knew it. What happened over those 2 hours was something more specific. Marlowe described what she understood had gone wrong at Ashcroft, not just mechanically but structurally, culturally, and Sawyer listened and occasionally corrected her and occasionally confirmed her. And the conversation had the quality of two people who are each arriving at the same place from different directions and mapping where those directions diverged. She was direct about Blaine Carrick in a way that was professional but not careful. He built a culture where the way to get ahead was to show Blaine you could make the numbers. The people who got promoted were the people who made the numbers. The people who raised concerns about how the numbers were being made got managed out or reassigned. She paused. "I should have seen it sooner. I've been in the role 6 months. In retrospect, some of the early patterns." She stopped herself. "But I didn't want to go into my first facility visit looking for reasons to be suspicious of my own COO. So I prepared to be impressed." "Were you?" Sawyer said. She looked at him. "By the facility, yes. The production outputs are genuinely good. The workforce is skilled. The problems were in what you couldn't see from the tour, what the tour was designed to not show. The tours usually are." She turned her espresso cup in her hands. "Tell me what you want from this position. Not what you think I want to hear. What you actually want." He thought about it for a moment. Not performing consideration, actually thinking, because it was a question that deserved an actual answer. "I want the authority to be real," he said, "not advisory. Not a seat at the table where I can express concern be overruled. I want the ability to stop production when something is wrong, and I want that ability to be structural, not dependent on whoever's in my reporting chain agreeing with me on a given day. That's in the position as I've designed it," she said. "I want the reporting channel to be genuinely independent of operations," he said. "Not adjacent to it, independent. So that safety concerns go to a path where production pressure can't touch them. Also in the design. And I want to train people," he said. "Not just have authority and a policy document. I want to actually work with the people on the floor, day shift and night shift both, so the safety culture is theirs, not something handed down from a new office." She was listening with the full attention she'd had on the production floor, the attention that was actually taking things in rather than waiting for a pause to respond. "That's workable," she said, "and it's actually central to what I want from this role anyway. A safety culture that depends on one person having authority doesn't survive that person leaving." "No," he said, "it doesn't." She looked at him. "The schedule," she said. "You mentioned it in the parking lot. Tell me what you need." "I need to be at my daughter's school events. I need to be home for dinner more nights than not. I need predictability in my hours so she can plan around me, because she's 13 and she does plan around me, even when she acts like she doesn't. And I need, if there's a crisis, if there's a situation that requires extended hours, I need advance notice where possible and flexibility where it isn't. All of that is something I can build in," she said. "I want to be honest, there will be periods where it's harder. Facility audits, incident response, regulatory reviews. Those will require more. But the baseline, the day-to-day, I can protect that." "How?" "By putting it in writing," she said. "Not a verbal commitment. An actual structural agreement. Scheduled hours, on-call protocols, clear delineation of what constitutes a mandatory extended event versus what falls within normal operations." He looked at her. "You've thought about this?" "Since Wednesday night," she said. "I couldn't sleep anyway." He nodded. He picked up his coffee, which had gone lukewarm. He thought about the East Wing, and the sensor readings, and the override log, and 3 reports that had gone into an inbox and come back out, marked cleared without anyone looking at them. He thought about 58 people on a production floor and a maintenance corridor behind panel row E and a door that wouldn't open until he made it open. He thought about Emery at the kitchen table. Think faster. I want to see the written offer before I give you a final answer, he said. Of course, and I want a 30-day probationary provision on both sides. If the authority isn't real in practice, not just on paper, I need to be able to walk away from it cleanly. She nodded. That's fair. And reasonable. And I want to bring Okafor with me. She blinked. Okafor. Night maintenance. He's been at the facility almost as long as I have. He did the head count during the evacuation without being asked. He's good. What role? Senior safety technician. Training and floor operations. I can't rebuild a safety culture from an office. I need someone who works the floor. Marlowe considered this for a moment. I'll need to review his file. You'll find 5 years of performance reviews that say meets expectations, Sawyer said, which is roughly as useful as mine. Something crossed her face. Not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. I'll review his actual record, she said. Not the reviews. That's all I'm asking. She extended her hand across the table. I'll have the written offer to you by Monday. He shook it. Her grip was direct, and she held it a beat past formal, which was consistent with how she did most things. One more thing, she said, as he was pulling on his jacket. He stopped. Blaine is going to fight this, she said. Not the investigation, he can't fight that. But the narrative. He's going to have lawyers making arguments about your conduct, about the alarm, about whether the evacuation was necessary, or whether the building would have held. He's going to try to make you look reckless. She looked at him steadily. I want you to be prepared for that. I've been prepared for that since Wednesday morning, he said. Good. She paused. I also want you to know that I'll be on record clearly about what your reports showed and when they were received and what was done with them. And about the fact that I authorized only a partial shutdown when you were asking for a full one. She held his gaze. That's not something I'm proud of, but I'm not going to obscure my own role in this to make Blaine's narrative easier to challenge. He looked at her for a moment. That's the right call, he said. I know, she said. It's still uncomfortable. He put on his jacket. Usually is, he said, and left. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Wednesday. Sawyer knew about it only because Ashby mentioned it on Sunday evening, a call to check in, brief and characteristic, Ashby covering what he needed to cover and not lingering. They're going to vote on Carrick's future with the company, Ashby said. The preliminary investigation report lands Monday. The board has it Tuesday, meeting Wednesday. Marlowe's presenting?
Yes.
And I understand she's bringing the full documentation. All 3 of your reports, the override renewal log, the clearance trail. A pause. Carrick will be there with counsel. Sawyer was standing in the backyard when the call came in because Emery had been inside doing homework and the house had the specific quiet of concentrated effort and he hadn't wanted to disrupt it. The yard in late afternoon was turning cold. The maple in the front had company back here, 2 large oaks dropping leaves in an accelerating process that was going to be genuinely significant by the weekend. I won't be there, Sawyer said. No, you won't need to be. The documentation speaks for itself. It does, Ashby paused. How's Emery? Annoyed that I'm not raking yet. 13-year-olds have priorities. She has opinions about leaves, Sawyer said. She has opinions about most things. She gets that honestly, Ashby said, and ended the call. Sawyer stood in the yard for a while after, looking at the leaves. He thought about the board meeting and what it would produce, and about the written offer that was supposed to arrive tomorrow, and about Okafor he'd texted him on Saturday. A brief message. I need to talk to you about something. Not urgent, but soon, Okafor had replied, I figured. Name the time. He thought about what the job would actually look like. The facility, rebuilt and reopened in some form, probably 6 months out, minimum, depending on the structural assessment and the regulatory review. Walking the floor in daylight, which was a genuinely strange thing to imagine after 5 years of nights. Having the authority to stop something he saw going wrong, and not having to carry it 3 levels up a chain that had a production calendar where the safety reports had been. He thought about the service corridor and the door, and the way it had finally given, and the specific quality of the air that came through when it did. He went inside. Emery was at the kitchen table with her textbook and her laptop and a glass of water she'd been refilling for the past hour without actually drinking. She looked up when he came in. "You're cold," she said. "You were out there without a jacket." "I'm fine." "Dad." "I'm fine, Emery." She looked at him for a moment, with the particular assessment she'd been running on him since Wednesday checking, beneath the surface of the ordinary evening, whether the equilibrium was real or performed. He held the look steadily, because the equilibrium was real, or real enough, and she needed to be able to see that. She went back to her textbook. "Rake the leaves tomorrow," she said. "Before it rains. I was planning on it. We can do it together if you want." He looked at her. She was reading or performing reading, her hair falling forward over one side of her face. "Yeah," he said. "We can do that." She nodded, very slightly, and turned a page, and he went to the counter to start dinner, and the house held the two of them in its ordinary evening warmth, which was exactly what it was supposed to do. The written offer arrived Monday morning at 7:42, 18 minutes after he'd dropped Emery at the corner. He read it at the kitchen table with his coffee, going through it twice, once fast to get the shape of it, and once slowly checking the specifics against what Marlowe had said in the cafe. The authority was real. He could see it in the language, not advisory, not consultative, actual operational authority to halt production in any facility section if safety thresholds were determined to be at risk. Direct reporting to the CEO, independent incident reporting channel with no operational management in the chain. Defined hours, on-call protocols, the 30-day mutual probationary provision he'd asked for, and 2 lines near the end of the benefits section that simply read, Senior Safety Technician T. Okafor position pending personnel review. He sat with it for a few minutes. He was not a person who made large decisions impulsively, and he was not going to start now. But he was also not a person who made large decisions slowly when the relevant information was already in front of him, because he'd spent enough of his life waiting for clarity that arrived too late. He picked up his phone and called the number on the offer letter, not Marlowe directly, the HR contact, and asked to confirm that the document was final and ready for signature. It was. He printed it at the small printer on the desk in the hallway that Emery used for school projects, signed both copies, took a photo of the signed pages, and sent them before he'd finished his second cup of coffee. Marlowe's reply came 4 minutes later, not through HR. From her direct address, 2 words, "Welcome aboard." He set his phone down. He sat at the kitchen table in a house that was quiet around him, in the mid-morning light he was still learning to exist in, and he thought about none of it for a full 60 seconds. Just sat with the fact of it, without running the math or examining the implications. The decision was made, and the decision was the right one, and that was enough for right now. Then he got up and washed his coffee mug and went to find the rake. The board meeting lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes, which Sawyer knew because Ashby texted him when it started and again when it ended, both times with the brevity of a man who understood that some information didn't require elaboration. The first text at 9:03 a.m., it's starting. The second at 1:14 p.m., it's done. Then 30 seconds later, call me when you can. Sawyer was in the backyard when the second text arrived, raking leaves in the particular November light that came through at an angle and made everything look simultaneously more beautiful and more temporary than it actually was. He'd been at it for an hour. Emery had lasted 40 minutes before remembering she had homework, which he'd accepted as a reasonable exit because she'd actually worked for those 40 minutes and hadn't complained about it once, which was a form of effort that deserved acknowledgement. He pulled off one work glove and called Ashby. "Carrick's out," Ashby said before Sawyer could speak. Effective immediately. The board accepted his resignation. It was framed as a resignation, which is the corporate version of being shown the door. His counsel negotiated the language. A pause, but the resignation doesn't affect the regulatory investigation. State Safety Board and OSHA are both proceeding independently of whatever the company decides internally. He could still face penalties, Sawyer said. He will face penalties. The question is the scope. That determination takes longer. Ashby paused again. Marlowe presented your 3 reports. She put them on the table physically, printed copies at the start of her presentation. She went through the timeline. The override renewal history, the clearance trail on the reports, the production deadline correlation. She presented it as a pattern of systemic failure rather than individual misconduct, which is legally accurate and strategically smart. And the board? 7-2. 2 abstentions. The two who voted against removal are tied to the production side. They're going to be a problem going forward. But for today, it didn't matter. He paused. Croft Blaine's operations manager, the one whose credentials were used to clear the reports, she's been placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. She's cooperating. Is she saying Blaine directed it? She's saying she was under significant pressure to clear anything that threatened the production timeline and that she understood the consequences of not doing so. Ashby's voice was dry, which is not quite the same as a direct order, but it's close enough that the investigators are interested. Sawyer stood in the yard with the rake in one hand and his phone in the other, looking at the pile of leaves he'd been building for the past hour. The oaks behind the house had mostly let go. The yard was covered in a depth of brown and rust, an occasional stubborn yellow, the kind of accumulation that came from two large trees deciding that autumn was over in the span of about a week. "How did Marlowe look?" he said. "Like someone who had done the right thing and wasn't particularly looking for applause for it," Ashby said. "Which is the correct way to look." And after, she left immediately. She had calls to make. The regulatory people, probably. "And I imagine she called you." Sawyer checked his phone. A missed call from Marlowe's direct line, time-stamped 11:47 in the middle of the meeting, which meant she'd stepped out at some point specifically to call him, which was its own kind of statement. He'd call her back in a few minutes. "Rourke," Ashby said.
"Yeah."
"You did the right thing. On the floor that morning, and with the reports, and with the offer." A pause. "I know you know that. I'm saying it anyway." "I know," Sawyer said. "And Emery should know too. What her father did." Sawyer looked at the leaf pile. "She knows enough. She should know all of it eventually. When she's ready. She's 13, Ashby. She's also the kid who interrogated you over breakfast about your decision-making process and told you to think faster." A brief pause. "She can handle it." He ended the call and stood there for a moment. The wind moved through the oaks and brought another small shower of leaves onto the section he'd just finished clearing, which was the fundamental problem with raking in any kind of wind, a problem he'd been solving imperfectly for as long as he'd owned this yard. He called Marlowe back. She answered on the first ring. "You saw Ashby's texts," she said, "and your missed call. I stepped out. I wanted you to know the direction before the vote came in case it went the wrong way." "It didn't." A pause. 7-2, Ashby told me. "The two who voted against are going to be my problem for a while. They think the investigation is being used to cover operational failures with a personnel story." Her voice was even. "They're not entirely wrong, by the way. The operational failures are real, and they predate Blaine. He made them worse, but he didn't create them from nothing." "That's honest," Sawyer said. "It's accurate. And it means the work isn't just replacing Blaine with someone better. It means actually looking at how the whole system was built." A pause. "Which is part of what I'm hoping you'll help with." "That's the job," he said. "Yes." She paused again. A different kind of pause, less operational. "How are you doing?" "With all of it." He considered the question. Not the version of it that people asked when they wanted to confirm you were functional, but the version she was actually asking. He'd been doing this long enough to tell the difference. "I'm all right," he said. "I have some things to sort out still. But I'm all right. The regulatory process is going to keep touching your life for a while," she said. "Testimony, probably. Documentation requests. It won't be clean and fast."
"I know."
"And people are going to have opinions about what you did. Some of those opinions will be wrong in ways that are frustrating." She paused. "I want you to know that my opinion isn't going to change based on how the politics of this settle." "I appreciate that," he said. "I also want to apologize," she said. "Formally. Clearly. I should have shut the whole wing down when you asked me to." He'd thought about how to respond to this if she said it, whether to accept the apology straight or to complicate it with the context. The fact that she'd had 3 minutes and a COO in her ear and a facility she'd been inside for less than an hour. He'd somewhere over the past week that the complicating context was real, but it wasn't what she needed from him right now. "I accept that," he said. "Thank you." A brief pause. "Monday. I'd like you to come in and meet the team you'll be working with. Interim operations leadership and the safety engineering department, what's left of it. We're also going to start the structural assessment review, and I want you in that conversation." "Monday works," he said. "And Sawyer." The shift to his first name was deliberate. He'd noticed she used it when the conversation moved out of formal register. Thank you. For the reports, for the alarm, for going back in. She paused. For the whole thing. You already thanked me, he said. I know. I'm doing it again. He looked at the leaf pile, which the wind had continued to dismantle while he was on the phone. I'll see you Monday, he said, and ended the call. He put the phone in his pocket and picked up the rake and spent the next 45 minutes finishing the yard. He was not particularly good at raking. He was methodical, which wasn't the same thing, and the wind was uncooperative, and by the end the pile was large and untidy and would need to be bagged before any wind came through again. But it was done, which was the relevant metric. He stood at the edge of it and looked at the cleared yard and felt the specific quiet satisfaction of a finished physical task, which was a different sensation than almost anything else he knew and one he'd always valued. He went inside. The weeks that followed had a particular quality that Sawyer had trouble describing when Emery asked him about it later. Not easy exactly, but purposeful in a way that the years of night shifts hadn't been. Not because the night shifts hadn't mattered, but because the purpose had been private then. The schedule, the paycheck, the time with Emery. Real purposes, but held close. This was different. He started at Ashcroft in an official capacity on the Monday after the board meeting, walking into the administrative building in daylight for the first time as an employee rather than a maintenance technician who'd been summoned to account for himself. He wore the same clothes he would have worn to a meeting, anywhere clean, dark, nothing that announced itself, because he'd learned a long time ago that the person who walked into a room trying to look like something was usually the least convincing version of whatever they were trying to be. The team he met that Monday was a mixed group. 2 safety engineers who'd been in their roles for less than a year and were visibly uncertain about what the department looked like now that the man who'd shaped it was gone, a compliance officer named Yoon, who had the careful precision of someone who'd been doing her job correctly in a system that didn't reward correctness, and Okafor, who arrived in a new-looking blazer and sat across from Sawyer with an expression that contained, beneath its professional surface, the particular quality of a person who had been adequately categorized for most of his career, and was now in a room where that wasn't the operating assumption. Sawyer looked at him. Okafor looked back. Nice jacket, Sawyer said. My wife bought it, Okafor said. She said I should look like I knew what I was doing. Do you most of the time? That's enough, Sawyer said. And it was. The first meeting was long and imperfect, and covered too much and not enough, the way first meetings do. Sawyer asked more questions than he answered, which was the correct approach when you were inheriting a structure that had failed and needed to understand how it had functioned before you could decide what to rebuild. He wanted to know what each person had seen, specifically not what they'd reported through official channels, but what they'd actually seen in the day-to-day operation of the facility that had felt wrong or uncertain or inconsistent. Ewan was the first to speak. She'd been in compliance for 3 years, and she had a list, not a formal list, but a mental list. The kind you keep when you know that the official record doesn't match the operational reality, and you're trying to decide whether saying so will cost you more than staying quiet. The items on her list were specific and documented, and had been submitted through channels that, it turned out, all eventually routed to the same operations inbox that Carrick's team managed. One of the junior safety engineers, a young man named Park, who looked like he'd been in his role for about 8 months, and had the unsettled expression of someone trying to recalibrate which direction the wind was blowing, said that he'd been told, during his onboarding, that safety flags that affected production timelines should be reviewed with the operations team before being formally submitted. Sawyer looked at him steadily. Who told you that? Park shifted in his chair, my supervisor, at the time. And your supervisor reported to the COO's office. Sawyer nodded slowly. He didn't say anything immediately. He let the fact of it sit in the room for a moment, not to dramatize it, but because it needed to be acknowledged as what it was not a misunderstanding or a miscommunication, but a deliberate instruction, passed down through a chain, designed to give the appearance of safety oversight without any of its function. That's done, Sawyer said. Starting today, if you have a safety flag, you submit it. To this department, to my direct line, to UN's compliance channel. You don't preview it with operations. You don't wait to see how it lands with anyone above you. You submit it and you document that you submitted it. If someone tells you otherwise, you bring it to me personally. Park nodded. He looked underneath the uncertainty, faintly relieved the particular relief of a person who has been waiting for someone to tell them that the thing that felt wrong was actually wrong. And nothing goes into an inbox that one person manages, Sawyer said. Every safety submission gets a logged receipt, a timestamp, and a second person on the confirmation. We build that into the system before the facility reopens. That's a significant process change, Ewan said, not objecting, noting. Yes, Sawyer said. It is. The structural assessment of the East Wing concluded in the third week of November. The engineer's report confirmed what Sawyer had understood since the morning of the incident. The E12 pressure line had been developing a microfracture in the fitting housing for an estimated 8 to 10 weeks, roughly consistent with the timing of his first safety report. The fracture had been caused by cyclic stress on a fitting that hadn't been replaced during the previous maintenance window, because replacing it would have required a partial shutdown. The report noted that the thermal anomalies Sawyer had detected were consistent with heat generated by the failing fitting under pressure, and that the pattern of escalating sensor readings he had documented was, in the assessment team's language, a clear and progressive indicator of imminent catastrophic failure. Sawyer read that language and felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite anger, a compound thing. The feeling of being vindicated by a document that also described, in measured engineering language, how close 58 people had come to not going home. He submitted the assessment to his file and moved on. The regulatory process was slower and less linear than everything else. OSHA opened a formal investigation in December. The State Safety Board had already issued a preliminary finding and was working toward a formal citation. Sawyer gave a deposition in January 4 hours, detailed with his attorney present, covering the timeline from his first sensor reading to the moment he pulled the alarm. He testified calmly, and specifically, the way he'd been trained to testify in other contexts, in other rooms, on other matters that had required the same kind of precision. Carrick's attorneys argued, in their filings, that Sawyer's evacuation had been premature, and that the building might have held long enough for the day's engineers to assess the situation through proper channels. The structural engineering report did not support this argument. The sensors data did not support this argument. The condition of the East Wing's roofline at 9 a.m. on the morning of the incident did not support this argument. These facts were in the record, and the record was not going to change because a set of attorneys would have preferred it to. The formal OSHA citation came in February. It was significant 7 violations, 3 of them willful, covering the override authorization practice, the safety report clearance process, and specific maintenance standards that had been deferred for the sake of the production timeline. The financial penalties were substantial. The remediation requirements were extensive. And the citation made public, clearly and in regulatory language, that the conditions at Ashcroft Dynamics in the weeks before the incident had constituted serious and knowing risk to worker safety. Blaine Carrick's name appeared in the citation document 14 times. Sawyer read it in his office, his actual office now, a room on the second floor of the administrative building, with a window that looked out over the facility's main entrance, and then set it aside and went to his next meeting, which was a 2-hour training session with the day shift floor supervisors on the new incident reporting protocol. The training was not glamorous work. It was careful, repetitive, specific work, the kind that required him to say the same things in different ways to different groups of people until the ideas became sufficiently internalized to actually change behavior. He was not a natural teacher in the way that some people were, all warmth and engagement. He was a clear teacher, which was a different, and in some ways more useful thing. He said what he meant in plain language, he answered questions without impatience, and he was consistent, which over time produced something more durable than inspiration. Okafor was better at the warmth. They'd figured that out in the first week and divided accordingly. Sawyer covered the protocol design and the authority-level conversations and the interactions with engineering and regulatory. Okafor covered the floor, the daily walkthroughs, the relationship with the workers, the conversations that happened at the coffee machine, and the locker room where people were honest in ways they weren't in formal settings. It worked because they'd worked alongside each other for years, and because the division wasn't a hierarchy, they moved information between each other constantly. The same way they'd communicated on the night shift when something needed 2 people to figure out. The facility reopened in March, 10 months after the incident. The East Wing had been rebuilt, not repaired, rebuilt with new pressure lines, new fitting hardware, updated monitoring systems, and a physical inspection process that required sign-off from 2 members of the safety department before any section of the wing could begin production. The opening was not ceremonial. Marlowe had specifically decided against a ribbon cutting or a press event, which Sawyer thought was exactly the right call. The building didn't need to celebrate its own reopening. It needed to go back to work and do it right. He was on the floor at 5:30 a.m., the first day of full production, which was earlier than he needed to be and later than he might have been in his previous life. He walked the East Wing once before the shift started, panel by panel, junction by junction, the new monitoring displays showing clean readings in the cool pre-dawn. The fitting on E12 was new hardware, correctly installed within spec. The emergency shutdown was operational, fully automatic, not overridden. He checked it himself. He stood at the control terminal at the south end of the wing. For a moment, the same terminal where he'd seen the override log on the night that started all of this, and looked at the readings. Normal. All of them. He nodded at them, which was not something he would have admitted to anyone, and went to get coffee. The conversation about what Sawyer had actually been, the military record, the SEAL background, the career he'd walked away from, moved through the company in the way information moves through a closed system, quickly, unevenly, and with variations from the original that ranged from minor distortion to outright mythology. He heard versions of himself that he didn't entirely recognize, and he found them mildly irritating in the way you find any story about yourself irritating, when it's been polished into something more coherent than the actual experience. He addressed it once, directly, in a meeting with the facility's management team in April. Not a dramatic disclosure, a practical one, because someone had asked him directly, and he saw no reason to be evasive. "I served 12 years, he said, SEAL teams. I left 8 years ago." He paused. "I left because I had a daughter who had been growing up while I was somewhere else, and I decided that was done." He looked around the room. The skills from that part of my life, the emergency response training, the experience reading environments under pressure, those are real, and I've used them. But they're not why I pulled the alarm that morning. I pulled the alarm because I could read the sensors and I knew the building, and I'd spent 9 months documenting what was wrong. He paused again. The military background let me go back in to get Ms. Marlowe and the others out. The maintenance background is why I knew where the service corridor was. They're both part of it. Neither one is the whole story. He left it there. He didn't invite questions about it, and most people in the room, to their credit, seemed to understand that the invitation wasn't coming. What he didn't say, in that meeting or anywhere else, was the thing that was harder to say, the thing he'd been slowly working out in the quiet moments between the meetings and the training sessions and the regulatory processes and the ordinary business of the job. He'd thought for a long time that the choice to take the night shift had been a compromise, that he'd traded one kind of purpose for another, smaller one, that the man who'd done the things he'd done in the teams had been set aside when he'd signed on as a maintenance technician, and what remained was the father version of him, useful present, but operating in a reduced range. He understood now that he'd been wrong about that. The man who'd read the service corridor in the dark, who'd done the arithmetic at 12:50 a.m. and understood what the numbers meant, who'd kept 3 years of personal logs on a home computer because he'd learned the cost of having no copy, that man had been built by everything. The teams, yes, but also 5 years of nights at a facility no one else watched as carefully. Also the particular attention you develop when someone depends on you and you can't afford to miss things. Also the specific kind of stubbornness that comes from being dismissed often enough that you stop waiting for permission and start trusting your own read of a situation. He'd thought those things were separate. They weren't. They were the same person, arrived at through different roads, and the version of him that existed on the other side of that morning was the version where all the roads had finally intersected at a point that mattered. He thought about this in the way he thought about most things, quietly, without broadcasting it, turning it over in the margins of other work until it settled into something he could live with. Emery came to the facility for the first time in May, on a Friday afternoon when school let out at noon for a teacher workday. She'd been asking to see it since January, with the specific persistence of a 14-year-old who has decided she's old enough to be included in things and is prepared to make that case repeatedly until the case is accepted. He picked her up from school and drove her out to the facility, and she sat in the passenger seat with her window down, despite the temperature, and her earbuds, despite the fact that he was talking to her, and he accepted both of these things as the cost of her company. At the facility entrance, she pulled the earbuds out and looked at the building, the whole of it, not just the east wing, which from the front looked mostly intact, the structural damage having been on the north and east sides. She was quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough that he looked at her. "It's bigger than I thought," she said. "Yeah." "Which part was it?" He pointed. "East wing. That section there, the newer-looking roof, is the rebuilt portion." She looked at it for a long time. He let her look. "Where was the service corridor?" she said. He had not told her about the service corridor in any detail. He described the incident in general terms, carefully calibrating for what was useful for her to know, versus what would simply produce images she'd carry at night. The service corridor had been in the latter category. "You read the report," he said. "The OSHA citation is public record, Dad." "We covered public records and civics." He looked at her. She was looking at the building. "It's on the north side," he said. "Behind the panel row in the east wing. You can't see it from here." She nodded. She kept looking at the building for another moment, and then she said quietly, "I'm glad you knew it was there." He didn't say anything to that. "I'm also still a little mad that you went back in," she said, with the careful precision of someone making a distinction. "I know, both things can be true." "Yes," he said. "They can." She looked at him then, sidelong, the way she looked at things she was deciding how much to say about. He waited. "Are you glad you took the job?" she said. He thought about it, the real answer, not the efficient one. He thought about the Monday morning meetings and the training sessions and the OSHA deposition and the day the facility reopened and the moment he'd stood at the E12 panel and looked at the clean readings. He thought about Park's face in that first team meeting when someone had finally told him that the thing that felt wrong actually was. He thought about Okafor in his new blazer. "Yeah," he said. "I'm glad." She nodded, satisfied with that, and put her earbud back in and got out of the car. He followed her toward the entrance, and she walked ahead of him the way she always did, slightly too fast, like she was trying to arrive somewhere before him, which he'd decided years ago was her version of independence and had stopped interpreting as anything else. He gave her the tour himself. He walked her through the administrative building, introduced her to Yoon and Park, and the two junior engineers, whose names she promptly memorized, because that was the kind of person she was. He walked her through the production floor, where the day shift was running at partial capacity, the machines loud and deliberate. The workers in their safety gear moving with the particular purposeful rhythm of people who know their work well. She was interested in everything in the precise, slightly aggressive way. She was interested in most things full attention. Questions that were sometimes obvious and sometimes not. No performance of either understanding or confusion. She asked Okafor how the new incident reporting system worked, and Okafor explained it to her with the genuine pleasure of a man who had helped build something and liked being asked about it. At the east wing entrance, she stopped. The wing was back in operation, but at reduced capacity, 2 of the 4 production lines running, the others still in the commissioning process. The new monitoring displays were lit across the panel row, clean numbers in green, the emergency shutdown indicator showing its operational status in the corner of each screen. She stood at the entrance and looked at the space for a long moment. He let her. "People work in here every day," she said. "Yeah. And now if something's wrong, there are multiple people who can stop it. And the alarm doesn't have a cover on it." She looked at him. "You took the cover off." "I broke it," he said. "They've redesigned the housing so it can't be covered." She looked at the panel row, the displays, the whole rebuilt interior of the wing, and he could see her doing the thing she did when she was integrating information, running it against what she already knew, finding where it fit. "Dad," she said. "Yeah, you know that thing you always say. About how you left the military because you wanted to be home when I needed you." "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. "I used to think that meant you gave something up. Like that was the thing you sacrificed." She paused. "But I think you actually just moved where you were doing it." She looked at him, and for a moment she looked less like 14 and more like the person she was going to be in another 10 years, clear-eyed, a little uncomfortable with what she'd understood, saying it anyway. "You were still doing it, You were just doing it here." He looked at her. He didn't say anything immediately. "I think that's right," he said, eventually. She looked back at the wing. "Okay," she said, the way she ended conversations when she'd gotten to the thing she was actually after. "Can we get food? I'm starving." He bought her a sandwich from the facility cafeteria, which she ate half of in the car and held the other half against her knee for the drive back, periodically taking bites and staring out the window at the afternoon moving by. He drove and didn't fill the silence, because they were both people who understood that some silences were full rather than empty and didn't require anything added to them. There's a thing that happens. When you've been invisible for long enough, that makes visibility feel foreign. Sawyer had been invisible deliberately, mostly for 8 years. Not hidden, not absent, but operating below the threshold of notice, which had suited him because he'd had a daughter to raise and a job to do, and no particular need for anyone outside those two things to have an opinion about him. The incident changed that. He hadn't wanted the change, and he hadn't pursued it, and he wasn't comfortable with all of its consequences, which included the occasional news piece that he declined to be interviewed for, the former colleagues who reached out with the specific energy of people, reframing a relationship in light of new information, and the strangers who said things to him at the grocery store or at Emery's school events that were meant as compliments and landed as something more complicated. He thought about this one evening in June, sitting on the back porch after Emery had gone to bed. The oaks had fully leafed out again, the yard in its summer state dense green, the sound of the neighborhood muffled by the growth. He was drinking bad coffee out of a mug he'd had for 12 years, a mug from a Navy commissary that he kept using specifically because it was ugly and held a lot. What he'd concluded over the months since the incident was not an insight exactly. It was more like a clarification of something he'd already understood but hadn't quite put into words. The people who get described as heroes are usually people who did the thing in front of them when the thing in front of them needed doing. Not because they were uniquely brave or uniquely skilled, though skill doesn't hurt, but because they'd done the work of being ready, the years of paying attention, the habit of keeping their own records, the specific decision to stay in a room and count heads instead of arguing about authority with someone who wasn't going to listen. The preparation wasn't dramatic. The preparation looked like a maintenance technician walking the East Wing every 40 minutes on a night shift when he could have sat in the break room. He thought about Emery's assessment from the day of the tour. You were still doing it. You were just doing it here. She was right, but the full picture was a little more complicated than that, and he thought she might understand it better when she was older, that there's a version of yourself you set aside when circumstances require it. And the thing you don't know, until the circumstances align, is that you never actually put it down. You just kept it in a room that didn't get opened very often. And when the door finally opened, everything in the room was still exactly where you'd left it, intact and available, because some things don't go away just because you stopped using them. He finished the bad coffee. The yard was dark and quiet around him, the oaks moving slightly in whatever breeze existed, up above the level where he was sitting. He thought about the East Wing, reopened and running. He thought about the new incident reporting system, which had already fielded 3 safety flags from floor workers in the 2 months since the facility reopened. 3 flags that had been received, logged, escalated to the correct people, and addressed. 2 of them had been minor. One of them had required a production pause of 4 hours while a hydraulic line was inspected and a fitting replaced. The production pause had cost money, and the operations team had not been pleased about it, and Sawyer had held the line, and Marlowe had backed him, and the line had been replaced, and the workers in that section had gone home on schedule. That was the job. Unspectacular most of the time. A fitting replaced before it failed. A flag submitted and acted on. A culture where the people on the floor understood that telling someone something was wrong would not cost them their position or their relationship with management or the comfort of the shift they'd worked hard to secure. He had not solved everything. The 2 board members who'd voted against Carrick's removal were still on the board, still oriented toward production metrics and quarterly outputs. The regulatory pressure would eventually ease, and with it some of the urgency that made change feel necessary. Organizations had a way of reverting to the shape of their incentives, and Ashcroft's incentives hadn't been comprehensively reformed, just because the man who'd built the worst version of them was gone. Sawyer knew that. He'd built the new systems with that knowledge in mind, redundant, documented, designed to function, without depending on any single person's presence or memory. If he left tomorrow, the incident reporting channel would still route correctly. The emergency shutdown would still be automatic. The records would still exist in multiple locations. That was, in the end, the most useful thing he could do. Not be indispensable. Build something that didn't need him to be. He went inside. The house was quiet, Emery's light still on under her door, which meant she was reading when she was supposed to be sleeping, which he decided to count as the lesser offense and walked past without comment. He went to the kitchen and rinsed the coffee mug and set it on the rack. His phone was on the counter, no messages, nothing urgent. Just the ordinary quiet of an evening that had stayed ordinary, which was, he'd come to understand more fully than he had before, its own kind of achievement. He turned off the kitchen light. He thought about what he'd said to Genevieve Marlowe in the service corridor, in the smoke, with the building coming apart around them. There isn't a contract on earth worth dying for. He'd said it to make her move, to get her away from the portfolio she'd gone back for, and it had worked because it was true, and she'd recognized it as true in the moment when the truth of it actually mattered. There were other versions of the same sentence, though, that he'd been living for years without quite articulating them. There isn't a deadline worth a building full of people. There isn't a production schedule worth burying a safety report. There isn't a career worth a warning you chose not to hear. And there isn't a version of yourself worth hiding if the room needs what you have. He went upstairs. He paused outside Emery's door, light still visible beneath it. He knocked twice, which was their signal for "I'm not coming in, just checking." A pause. Then her voice muffled the studied casualness of someone pretending they hadn't been reading. "I was just going to sleep." "I know," he said. "Night, Dad, night." He went to bed. He fell asleep without the usual accounting of the day's decisions, without running the timeline, without the low-level alert that had been part of his sleeping architecture for most of his adult life. It had been loosening for months, that alertness not disappearing entirely, because it never would, but settling into something quieter and less constant, something more like attentiveness than vigilance. He slept well. 2 years later, on a Tuesday in September, a new hire in the East Wing submitted his first safety flag. He'd been at the facility for 3 weeks, fresh out of a technical program, younger than most of the people around him and aware of it. He'd noticed a reading on a secondary monitor that didn't match the primary display, and he'd flagged it, and the flag had gone into the system and received an automatic confirmation within 30 seconds. And within the hour, a safety technician had been on the floor to verify it. The reading was a calibration error, minor, corrected in 20 minutes with no production impact. The young worker told Sawyer about it in passing, not because he was required to, but because Sawyer happened to be walking through the section when the technician finished the check. "I wasn't sure if it was worth flagging," the young man said. "It seemed small." "That's what you flag," Sawyer said. "The small ones. While they're still small." The young man nodded. He looked satisfied with that answer, in the way people look when they've been told something they already suspected was true. Sawyer kept walking. At the south end of the wing, he stopped at the monitoring terminal, the same position, roughly, where he'd stood at 12:50 a.m. on a cold morning 2 years, and a few months ago. The displays were clean, all readings in range. The emergency shutdown indicator showed operational. The incident log on the secondary screen showed 3 entries for the week, all minor, all addressed. He looked at it for a moment, not long. Then he walked back through the wing, nodded at Okafor coming the other direction with a tablet and a coffee, and the expression of a man who had too many things to do and was fully prepared for all of them, and headed to his car. He had 40 minutes before Emery's school let out. Enough time, if the traffic cooperated, which it usually didn't, which meant he'd be 2 minutes late, and she'd make a point of it, and they'd argue about it mildly for approximately the first mile, and then move on to whatever she actually wanted to talk about. He drove. The city moved past him in the particular September light golden, slightly sharp, the quality of light that made everything look like it was being seen for the first time, even when you'd seen it 1,000 times before. He thought about nothing specific. The week ahead, the ongoing OSHA follow-up that was nearly complete, the training session Thursday morning with the night shift supervisors, the dinner he was going to have to figure out before 5 o'clock. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. "Emery, are you going to be late?" He typed back at a red light, which he knew she would lecture him about, maybe 2 minutes. Dad, I know you said you were leaving early. I left on time. That's not early, that's on time, Emery. A pause. Then I'm just saying. 2 minutes is 2 minutes. He smiled at his phone, which was an undignified response, and he would deny it if asked. The light changed. He put the phone down and drove. She was on the curb when he pulled up, backpack over one shoulder, looking at her phone with the focused option of a person who has decided to be visibly not watching for her father's car. She got in, dropped the backpack at her feet, and looked at him. 2 minutes, she said. 1.5, he said. She considered this. Fine. She put her seatbelt on. Can we get Parmesan on the way home? You're out. I know I'm out. I was going to go this weekend. But we need it for tonight. What are you making tonight? She looked out the window as he pulled back into traffic. Pasta, she said, as if this were obvious. You always make pasta. Because it's good. She turned and looked at him briefly, with the evaluating look she'd had since she was small. Then she turned back to the window. You look tired. I'm fine. You always say that. It's usually true. She was quiet for a block. Then, good day. He thought about the East Wing, and the young worker's small flag, and the clean readings on the monitoring display. He thought about Okafor with his tablet and his coffee, and his general readiness. He thought about the incident log showing 3 entries for the week, all addressed. Yeah, he said. Good day. She nodded, satisfied, and put her earbud in one, not both, which was her version of staying in the conversation, and they drove home through the September light, the city ordinary and continuous around them, the kind of evening that doesn't announce itself as anything other than what it is. Which, when you've been paying attention long enough, turns out to be enough.